The rain falls mercilessly on a tree-lined suburban street in Boston. Elegant homes with manicured lawns stand like silent witnesses to the scene unfolding before one particular residence. A man in his early 40s stands motionless on the sidewalk, rainwater streaming down his face, mixing with what might be tears. His hands rest protectively on the shoulders of two children, twins, a boy and a girl no more than 10 years old. Moving men shuttle boxes from the house to a waiting truck. The front door is held open by an elegant woman in her 60s dressed in expensive clothes that seem impervious to the downpour. Her face is a mask of cold determination. Matthew Reed never thought much about money until he didn't have any. Sitting on the front steps of the dilapidated house on Oak Street, watching paint peel from the shutters in long, deliberate strips, he turns his late wife's wedding ring over and over between his fingers. The simple gold band catches the afternoon light, reflecting memories of a time when love seemed enough to conquer anything. They had met at the Metropolitan Museum of Art 12 years ago. Matthew was there researching for an article on war paintings for the history journal he contributed to alongside his teaching position. Olivia was sketching visitors, her blonde hair falling like a curtain across her face as she worked. When she looked up at his approach, her green eyes held a warmth that made him forget whatever clever opening line he'd prepared. "You're blocking my view of the soldier's face," she said. "I'm sorry, I was just admiring how you've captured the light in the painting. I wasn't painting the artwork, I was painting you looking at it. You stood there for 20 minutes. What were you seeing that took so long?" That was Olivia, direct but never harsh, curious about everything and everyone. She came from the kind of family that appeared in the society pages of newspapers, but she wore faded jeans and paint-stained sweaters to galleries. Her father, Richard Hamilton, owned half the commercial real estate in the city. Her mother, Victoria, traced her lineage back to banking pioneers and spoke in the clipped tones of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. Matthew's family ran a small bookstore in a neighboring town. His father worked with his hands, knew the names of every customer, and believed that a man's worth was measured by his integrity rather than his bank account. When Matthew brought Olivia home for the first time, his parents welcomed her with the kind of warmth that money couldn't buy. When Olivia brought Matthew to meet the Hamiltons, the reception was decidedly cooler. Teaching is a noble profession. Richard Hamilton's tone made clear it was anything but. The dining room of the Hamilton mansion stretched around them, the table long enough to seat 20, though only 4 were present. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier overhead, refracting it across the white tablecloth like scattered diamonds. Of course, positions at prestigious universities pay considerably more than public ones. Matthew wants to make a difference in the community. He believes education should be accessible to everyone. Olivia's hand found his under the table, a small act of rebellion against the judgment flowing from her parents. How idealistic! Victoria Hamilton's smile was as cold as the silver serving dishes arranged before them. Despite their disapproval, Olivia had chosen Matthew. They were married in a small ceremony in the garden of the Reed family bookstore. Though Victoria made it clear she would have preferred something grander, Olivia wore her grandmother's dress not because she couldn't afford something new, but because she loved the story behind it. Her grandmother had eloped during the Depression, choosing love over social expectations. "She was my inspiration," Olivia told Matthew on their wedding night, sitting on the edge of their hotel bed, her grandmother's lace veil still pinned in her hair. "She taught me that real wealth has nothing to do with money." The twins arrived 2 years later. Noah with Matthew's analytical mind and protective instincts. Sophie with Olivia's artistic soul and thoughtful nature. They lived happily in a beautiful brownstone near the university where Matthew taught. Olivia worked part-time at a local art gallery, more for the joy of it than necessity. She had access to her trust fund, but they rarely touched it except for emergencies. "I want the children to understand the value of things," Olivia would say when Matthew suggested they could afford something nicer. "I don't want them to grow up thinking money solves everything." The Hamiltons visited occasionally, always with subtle criticism disguised as concern. The house wasn't prestigious enough. Matthew's position wasn't advancing quickly enough. The children should be in private school. Olivia deflected their comments with grace, but Matthew could see the strain it caused her. When the twins were 8, Olivia found the tumor. She said nothing for weeks, hoping it would disappear, but Matthew noticed her distraction during their evening walks through the neighborhood. He noticed how she held her left arm differently, how she paused longer than usual when climbing stairs. "It's probably nothing," she said when she finally told him about the doctor's appointment. It wasn't nothing. The diagnosis was aggressive brain cancer, And despite the best medical care money could buy, the prognosis was grim. Olivia faced the treatments with the same quiet courage she brought to everything else. She made lists, instructions for Matthew about the children's routines, their likes and dislikes, their fears and dreams. Noah needs logic when he's upset. Explain the things clearly and he'll process it better. Sophie will retreat into her art before she can talk about her feelings. Let her draw it out. During those long months of treatment, the Hamiltons made their opinions clear. They wanted Olivia to come home to the estate where she could be properly cared for. They wanted the children to attend Westfield Academy, their alma mater. They wanted Matthew to accept a position at Hamilton Industries, something with more security and prestige. They mean well, Olivia said after a particularly tense visit from her mother. Do they? Matthew asked gently. Olivia was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the small garden she had planted when they first moved in. I think they're afraid that when I'm gone, they'll lose the children too. They won't lose them. We're family. Olivia looked at him then, and something flickered in her expression, a sadness he couldn't quite interpret. Promise me something, Matthew. Promise me you'll remember that you're enough. Just as you are enough. He promised, though he didn't understand why she seemed so worried about it. Olivia's health declined rapidly in the final months. She spent hours in her study writing letters and making phone calls she wouldn't discuss. Matthew assumed she was handling her affairs, ensuring the children's education funds were properly managed. He was focused on being present for every moment they had left, treasuring the quiet conversations and gentle touches that would soon be memories. The day she died, holding his hand while the twins slept curled against her hospital bed, Olivia's last words were about the children. Take care of them. Help them remember that love is the only thing that lasts. The funeral was held at St. Mary's Episcopal Church, where the Hamilton family had attended for generations. Victoria took charge of the arrangements, organizing a service that reflected the family's social standing more than Olivia's humble nature. Matthew sat in the front pew with Noah and Sophie, watching colleagues and acquaintances file past the ornate casket, and felt utterly alone despite the crowd. In the weeks that followed, the Hamiltons began their campaign of gentle pressure. They visited daily, bringing elaborate meals the children barely touched, and suggestions about practical arrangements. The house was too full of memories. The children needed stability. Matthew needed support raising them alone. We're family, Victoria would say, her hand resting possessively on Sophie's shoulder. We want what's best for everyone. Matthew tried to be gracious. They were grieving too, and he understood their desire to feel useful. But their version of help felt increasingly like control. They criticized his parenting choices, his financial decisions, his plans for the children's future. When he mentioned keeping the twins in public school, Richard made calls to private institutions without consulting him. We can afford to give them advantages, Victoria argued when Matthew protested. Olivia would have wanted that. Olivia wanted them to have a normal childhood. She said so many times. Matthew's voice remained steady, though his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Olivia was sick. Victoria's voice gentled in a way that felt condescending. She wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. That night, Matthew found Olivia's journal in her desk drawer. Her handwriting grew shakier as the entries progressed, but her thoughts remained clear and purposeful. She wrote about her love for him, her hopes for the children, and her growing concern about her parents' intentions. They see Matthew as temporary. They think grief will make him more pliable, more willing to accept their version of what's best. They don't understand that his strength comes from his principles, not his circumstances. I pray he remembers who he is when they try to change him. Reading those words, Matthew felt Olivia's presence as clearly as if she were sitting beside him. She had known this would happen. She had tried to prepare him, but he had been too focused on losing her to hear the warning. The final confrontation came on a gray October morning, 6 weeks after the funeral. Matthew was making breakfast when he heard the moving truck in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, he watched Victoria directing workers toward the house. What's happening? Sophie asked, clutching her stuffed rabbit, a gift from Olivia on her 8th birthday. I don't know, sweetheart, Matthew said, but his heart was already sinking. Victoria entered without knocking, her expression set with the kind of determination Matthew had learned to fear. We've made arrangements. The children will be more comfortable at the estate, and you'll have time to figure out your next steps. My next steps? You can't raise them properly on a teacher's salary, Richard said, following his wife into the kitchen. The morning light through the window cast harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing the deep lines around his mouth. Olivia's gone, Matthew. The practical realities haven't changed just because we're all grieving. Sophie began to cry quietly, and Noah moved protectively to his sister's side. Matthew knelt to their level, his hands steady despite the rage building in his chest. Go pack some clothes. We're going to stay somewhere else for a while. You don't understand. Victoria's voice rose slightly, her composure cracking. This isn't a request. The house belongs to the family trust. Olivia lived here at our discretion, and that arrangement died with her. The words hit Matthew like a physical blow. In all their years together, Olivia had never mentioned that the house wasn't truly theirs. She had paid the bills, handled the finances, protected him from the details that would have made him feel like a charity case. 1 week, Richard said, not unkindly, but with the finality of someone accustomed to being obeyed. That should be enough time to find somewhere appropriate. They left Matthew alone with the twins and the workers, who began systematically packing their lives into boxes. Sophie sat on her bed, drawing furiously in her sketchbook while tears ran down her cheeks. Noah helped pack with the mechanical efficiency of someone in shock. Are we going to live with Grandma and Grandpa? Sophie asked, her voice small and uncertain. Matthew looked at his daughter's hopeful face and felt something break inside him. No, sweetheart, we're going to find our own place. But where he didn't have an answer. Olivia's death had left him unprepared for practical challenges that seemed insurmountable. His professor's salary could cover rent and basic expenses, but he had no savings for deposits or moving costs. The life insurance policy would help, but it was tied up in probate. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Matthew opened it to find James Chen, his colleague from the history department, standing on the porch with a thermos of coffee and an envelope. James was in his 70s, a distinguished professor emeritus who had mentored Matthew when he first joined the faculty. His weathered face showed concern beneath his usual stoic expression. Olivia contacted me 2 months ago. She asked me to give you this if certain circumstances arose. I believe those circumstances have arrived. The envelope contained a key and an address on Oak Street. There's a house? The owner is looking for someone responsible to rent it cheap in exchange for fixing it up. It's not much, but it's got good bones and a yard for the children. Matthew stared at the offering, overwhelmed by the realization that Olivia had anticipated this moment. Why would she come to you with this? James's expression softened, the lines around his eyes deepening with an old sorrow. Because 30 years ago, I lost my wife to cancer, and my in-laws tried to take my son. Olivia knew I would understand what you might face. Matthew felt a rush of gratitude for his wife's foresight, mingled with grief that she had spent her final months preparing for a battle she wouldn't live to fight. Thank you, he said. The words seemed inadequate for what James was offering, not just shelter, but understanding. James nodded, his hand briefly gripping Matthew's shoulder. Olivia also said to remind you of something when the time came. Sometimes the only family that matters is the one that chooses to love you. As the moving truck pulled away from the house where his children had taken their first steps and lost their first teeth, Matthew made a silent promise to Olivia. He would prove that her faith in him hadn't been misplaced. He would show the twins that a man's worth wasn't measured by his bank account or his social connections. He would teach them that love indeed was the only thing that lasted. The house on Oak Street stood before them like a question mark, weathered, uncertain, but full of possibility. Matthew gathered his children close and turned Olivia's ring one more time before slipping it into his pocket. They were home. The eviction notice had arrived on official letterhead delivered by a courier who waited while Matthew signed for it with trembling hands. The formal language couldn't disguise the message. They had 72 hours to vacate the premises. Matthew stared at the document in the gray morning light, coffee growing cold in his cup. 6 weeks since Olivia's funeral and the Hamiltons had made their move. The notice cited breach of residency agreement and failure to maintain property standards, legal fiction designed to provide cover for what was essentially a family coup. Daddy, Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Why is there a truck outside? Through the window, Matthew could see the moving truck parked in their driveway like a patient predator. 2 workers sat in the cab waiting for instructions. Victoria Hamilton stood on the front lawn in her wool coat, checking her watch with the precision of a general coordinating an invasion. We're going to be moving. Are you moving? Matthew said, carefully setting down the notice. Remember how we talked about adventures? Noah's face, so much like Olivia's in the shape of his eyes, and the curve of his mouth showed a maturity beyond his years. Is it because of the money I heard Grandma talking to Grandpa about how we can't afford to stay here? Matthew felt a flash of anger that the children had been exposed to these adult concerns, but he kept his tone measured. It's a bit more complicated than that, but yes, this house belongs to your grandparents, and we need to find our own place. Sophie appeared beside her brother, still in her pajamas, clutching the sketchbook she had barely let out of her sight since Olivia's death. What about Mom's garden and her studio? The garden. Olivia had spent countless hours nurturing the small plot behind the house, teaching the twins to plant seeds and tend seedlings. Sophie had helped her choose the flowers while Noah had been fascinated by the vegetables. It was where Olivia had felt strongest during her illness, drawing energy from the earth and sunshine. "We'll make a new garden and a new studio," Matthew promised, though he had no idea how he would fulfill that promise. Before either child could respond, the front door opened without ceremony. Victoria entered with the authority of ownership, followed by Richard and two men in expensive suits Matthew didn't recognize. "Good morning." Victoria's tone suggested this was anything but good. "I trust you received the notice. We've arranged for a moving service to help with the transition." "You can't just throw us out." Matthew rose to his full height, the eviction notice crumpling in his grip. "This is our home." "This house belongs to the Hamilton Family Trust," Richard replied, consulting a folder thick with legal documents. "Olivia had usage rights during her lifetime, but those rights weren't transferable. Surely you understood that." Matthew hadn't understood that at all. Olivia had handled their finances, paid the utilities, dealt with maintenance issues. She had protected him from feeling like a dependent, and in doing so had left him vulnerable to this moment. "Where are we supposed to go?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Victoria's expression softened fractionally as she looked at her granddaughter. "Darling, you and Noah will come home with us. Grandfather has already arranged enrollment at Westfield Academy, and your rooms are waiting at the estate." "What about Daddy?" Noah demanded, stepping closer to Matthew's side. "Your father needs time to make proper arrangements for his future," Victoria said carefully. "He'll visit, of course." "No." The word came out sharper than Matthew intended, startling everyone in the room. "We stay together. That's not negotiable." One of the lawyers cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed, I understand this is emotional, but you need to consider what's practical. The children have substantial trust funds that will ensure their education and security. You want what's best for them." "I am what's best for them," Matthew said quietly. "I'm their father." Richard stepped forward, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a man accustomed to getting his way through patience rather than force. "Matthew, be realistic. You can't provide for them the way we can: private schools, college funds, cultural opportunities." "None of that matters if they lose their family," Matthew interrupted. "We are their family," Victoria said, her composure cracking slightly. "We're their blood. You're just—" Matthew's voice remained calm, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Victoria caught herself, but the damage was done. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Sophie began to cry. Not the dramatic sobbing of a child seeking attention, but the quiet, heartbroken weeping of someone who understood that the adults had failed her. Noah put his arm around his sister, his jaw set with determination. "We're not going anywhere without Dad." "Now see here, young man," Richard began. "No," Noah said, his voice carrying more authority than a 10-year-old should possess. "Mom told us that families stick together no matter what. She said that's what makes them families." Matthew felt a surge of pride so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. Olivia's values lived on in their children, stronger than any legal document or financial pressure. "Very well," Victoria said, her mask of concern slipping to reveal something colder underneath. "If that's your choice, you have until tomorrow evening to collect your personal belongings and leave." "And go where?" Matthew asked. Victoria shrugged with studied indifference. "That's hardly our concern anymore." The next 36 hours passed in a blur of packing and desperate phone calls. Matthew contacted every rental agency in the city, but his salary and lack of security deposit eliminated most options. The few properties he could afford were either unsafe or unavailable immediately. James Chen appeared at intervals with coffee and quiet support. He helped Sophie pack her art supplies while Matthew wrestled with the larger furniture. Noah appointed himself inventory manager, creating careful lists of what they were taking and what they were leaving behind. "Will we ever come back?" Sophie asked as they loaded the last boxes into Matthew's aging sedan. Matthew looked at the house where his children had learned to walk, where he and Olivia had dreamed about their future, where love had been the only currency that mattered. The garden was already showing signs of neglect, the late-season flowers drooping without Olivia's careful attention. "I don't know, sweetheart, but wherever we go, we'll be together." The house on Oak Street looked like hope that had been abandoned and left to weather. The paint was peeling, the front steps sagged, and several windows were covered with plywood. but it had a roof, four walls, and rent Matthew could manage if he was careful. James had driven them there in his practical sedan, having insisted they needed a proper escort to their new home. He produced a key from his pocket with the ceremony of someone passing on an important trust. The owners had been looking for the right tenant, someone who will see the potential instead of just the problems. Inside the house smelled of dust and abandonment. The rooms were larger than Matthew had expected, with high ceilings and hardwood floors, hidden beneath years of neglect. Sophie walked through the empty spaces like a small ghost, her footsteps echoing in the silence. "It needs work," Noah observed with the practicality he'd inherited from both parents. "It needs love," Matthew corrected, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "And we've got plenty of that." They spent their first night on air mattresses in the living room, sharing a pizza James had insisted on buying. By lamplight, the room looked less forbidding, the shadows softer, the possibilities more apparent. "Tell us about when you and Mom first moved in together," Sophie requested, snuggling against Matthew's side. So Matthew told them about the tiny apartment near the university, how they'd furnished it with hand-me-downs and yard sale finds, how Olivia had painted murals on the walls to make it feel like home. He told them about the first dinner party they'd hosted, serving spaghetti on mismatched plates to friends who became family. "Were you scared?" Noah asked. "Terrified, but scared in a good way, like standing at the edge of something wonderful." Sophie considered this seriously. "Are we scared in a good way now?" Matthew looked around the empty room at his children's faces, illuminated by the warm glow of the lamp, and felt something shift inside him. The eviction notice had been meant to break him, to force him to surrender his children to a life he couldn't provide. Instead, it had freed him from the weight of other people's expectations. "Yes, I think we are." Outside, the wind rattled the old windows, but inside their circle of light, the Reed family began the work of building a new home from nothing but love and determination. 3 months into their new life, Matthew discovered that poverty was less about not having money and more about the constant mental mathematics of survival. He could tell you the exact cost of a gallon of milk at 3 different stores, knew which day the bakery marked down day-old bread, and had memorized the bus schedule that would get him between home, the university, and his 2 part-time jobs with minimal transfers. Mornings began at 5:30 with preparation for his early classes at the university. Afternoons found him at the local museum, cataloging war artifacts for a special exhibition. Evenings were reserved for tutoring high school students in their affluent homes, where he sat at kitchen islands that cost more than his monthly rent and helped teenagers understand the historical significance of events that suddenly felt very personal. The teaching award from the university sat propped against the windowsill in his makeshift home office, a dusty corner of the living room where he graded papers by lamplight. The engraved plaque read, "Matthew Reed Excellence in Education 2020. Sometimes when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, he would look at those words and remember who he had been before grief and circumstance had redefined his life. Noah and Sophie adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience that children possess but shouldn't need to use. They enrolled at Jefferson Middle School, a public institution that bore no resemblance to the private academies the Hamiltons had preferred. The building was older, the resources limited, but the teachers cared deeply about their students' success. Sophie struggled most with the transition. She had inherited Olivia's sensitive nature, along with her artistic talent, and the chaos of their new reality manifested in her drawings. Where she had once sketched flowers and family portraits, her recent work featured dark, swirling storms and houses that looked perpetually on the verge of collapse. "She's processing," explained Ms. Rivera, the school counselor, when Matthew came for a conference. "Children often express their emotions through art before they can verbalize them. The important thing is that she's still creating." Noah, meanwhile, had appointed himself the family's unofficial guardian. He walked Sophie to her classes, helped her carry her art supplies, and deflected questions from curious classmates about why they had moved. At home, he insisted on helping with dinner preparation and household chores, his small face serious with self-imposed responsibility. "You don't have to take care of everything," Matthew told him one evening as they repaired a loose floorboard together. "Mom said families help each other," Noah replied, not looking up from the hammer he was wielding with careful precision. "This is how I help." Their new neighborhood was a study in contrasts. Some houses were well-maintained with tidy yards and fresh paint. Others, like theirs, showed the accumulated wear of deferred maintenance and economic struggle. But there was a sense of community here that had been absent from their previous life neighbors, who checked on each other, children who played in the streets without scheduled supervision, families who understood that wealth wasn't measured solely in dollars. James lived across town but visited regularly with books for the children and practical advice for Matthew. He appeared one Saturday with tools and lumber, insisting that the front steps couldn't wait for the landlord's attention. People think poverty is about lacking things, he told Matthew as they worked, but it's really about lacking choices. The trick is making sure your children understand the difference. The house itself was slowly yielding to their efforts. Matthew had discovered a talent for renovation that surprised him. Weekends were devoted to painting walls, fixing leaky faucets, and coaxing life back into rooms that had been neglected for too long. Sophie chose colors for her bedroom, soft blues and greens, that reminded her of her mother's garden. Noah preferred practical improvements, better lighting for homework shelves for his books, a workspace where he could build the model airplanes that had become his latest passion. Their first small victory came when Matthew managed to repair the front steps. He had salvaged lumber from a construction site and spent an entire Saturday measuring, cutting, and hammering. When he finished, the steps were level and sturdy, a small improvement that felt monumental. "They look like real steps now," Sophie observed, testing them carefully. "They are real steps," Matthew replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Built to last." That evening, as they sat on their newly repaired front porch eating ice cream cones James had brought over, Matthew felt something he hadn't experienced since Olivia's death. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, that seemed too ambitious, but a quiet sense of accomplishment. The financial pressure was constant but manageable. Matthew's 3 jobs provided enough income to cover rent, utilities, groceries, and basic necessities. There was no money for extras, no family vacations, restaurant meals, or new clothes unless absolutely necessary. But they weren't hungry and they weren't homeless. And some days that felt like prosperity. Mrs. Rivera called one afternoon to discuss Sophie's progress. "She's incredibly talented, but I'm concerned about some of her recent work. There's a sadness there that goes beyond normal childhood experiences." Matthew arranged to meet with Miss Rivera after school. She showed him Sophie's portfolio, dozens of drawings that chronicled their family's journey from loss to displacement to tentative rebuilding. The progression was remarkable. Early pieces were chaotic and dark, but recent work showed emerging signs of hope. A house with strong foundations, a family of 3 figures holding hands against a backdrop of storms. "She's working through her grief," Ms. Rivera explained. "Art is her way of making sense of change, but she might benefit from the after-school art program we're starting. It's free, and it would give her more time to develop her skills." Matthew hesitated. The program ran until 600 p.m., which would mean Sophie taking the bus home alone or waiting for him to finish his museum job. But the opportunity was too valuable to pass up. "We'll make it work," he decided. That night, when he told Sophie about the art program, her face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen in months. "They're really with real supplies and everything. Ms. Rivera says you have exceptional talent." Matthew replied, his chest tight with emotion. Sophie hugged him fiercely, and for a moment Matthew felt rich beyond measure. Noah's adjustment had been quieter, but no less significant. His protective instincts had sharpened, but so had his sense of justice. When a classmate made fun of Sophie's thrift store clothes, Noah had stood up to him with words rather than fists, a maturity that impressed his teachers and worried his father in equal measure. "He's carrying too much responsibility for his age," Matthew confided to James during one of his visits. "Maybe," James replied, watching Noah help Sophie with her homework at the kitchen table. "Or maybe he's learning what real strength looks like. Sometimes children surprise us with how much they can handle when they know they're loved." As autumn settled over their neighborhood, the house on Oak Street began to feel less like a refuge and more like a home. Matthew had planted a small garden in the backyard, nothing as elaborate as Olivia's, but enough to provide fresh vegetables and give the children a connection to the earth their mother had loved. The teaching award caught the evening light from its place on the windowsill, its bronze surface reflecting the warm glow of their simple living room. Matthew looked at it and realized that excellence in education wasn't just about curriculum and test scores. It was about teaching his children that their worth wasn't determined by their circumstances, that family was built through love and commitment rather than wealth and status. They were learning those lessons together, one repaired step at a time. One crisp October morning, Sophie woke with a high fever. By afternoon, her breathing had become labored, and Matthew rushed her to the emergency room. The diagnosis was severe pneumonia complicated by an underlying respiratory condition they hadn't known about. As Sophie was admitted to the pediatric ward, Matthew felt a surge of panic that had nothing to do with her medical condition and everything to do with his financial reality. Their health insurance was basic at best, a high-deductible plan that would cover catastrophic events, but leave them with thousands in out-of-pocket expenses for something like this. "We'll need your insurance information," the admitting nurse said, gently sensing his distress. Matthew fumbled in his wallet for the card, his mind racing with calculations. The emergency room visit alone would wipe out their small savings. If Sophie needed to stay overnight, "Here," he said, handing over the card with a sinking heart. The nurse swiped it through her reader, looked at the screen, and smiled. "You're all set, Mr. Reed. This is a comprehensive plan with no deductible for pediatric care. Sophie's treatment is fully covered, including any medications she'll need when she goes home." Matthew stared at her in confusion. "That can't be right. We have the basic university plan." "Not according to this. Your family is covered under the Hamilton Elite Health Plan. It's one of the best policies we see." She turned the screen so he could see the information. "It shows active coverage through 2035. Before Matthew could process this information, the pediatrician arrived to discuss Sophie's treatment. The immediate crisis demanded his full attention, but as he sat beside his daughter's hospital bed that night, watching her sleep beneath the oxygen mask, the mystery of the insurance nagged at him. He had never purchased a premium health plan, couldn't have afforded it on his salary, and the Hamilton name connected to the policy suggested something he hardly dared consider. On the third day of Sophie's hospitalization, Matthew returned home briefly to shower and bring her fresh clothes. While searching through her backpack for the stuffed rabbit she'd requested, he found a small envelope he'd never seen before. Inside was an insurance card in Sophie's name and a note in Olivia's handwriting. "For emergencies, both children are covered. Don't worry about the cost." Sitting on Sophie's bed, the card trembling in his hands, Matthew felt a rush of emotions: gratitude, confusion, and a hint of betrayal. Olivia had arranged this without telling him, had somehow maintained a connection to her family's resources while letting him believe they were living independently. Why keep it secret? Why not share that this safety net existed? The answer came to him slowly as he looked around Sophie's room at the watercolor paintings taped to the walls, the bookshelf he'd built from scrap lumber, the curtains sewn from fabric remnants. Olivia had wanted their children to know the value of things, to understand that love and creativity mattered more than material possessions. If Matthew had known about the premium insurance, would he have felt the same urgency to build this life from scratch? Or would he have relied more on the safety net, compromised more with the Hamiltons, allowed their influence to seep into the family's daily existence? When he returned to the hospital, Victoria and Richard Hamilton were standing outside Sophie's room, deep in conversation with her doctor. Matthew stopped short, his heart racing. He hadn't contacted them about Sophie's illness and had deliberately avoided doing so, fearing they would use the situation to reassert control. Victoria saw him first, her elegant features composing themselves into an expression of concern. "Matthew, we came as soon as we heard." "How did you hear?" The question came out more sharply than he intended. "The insurance company notified us," Richard explained, "as policy administrators." Of course. The policy was in their name, probably part of a corporate package for Hamilton Industries executives. They would have been alerted when a major claim was filed. "How is she?" Victoria asked, and Matthew heard genuine worry in her voice. "Improving. They're talking about releasing her tomorrow if her oxygen levels stay up." Victoria nodded, relief visible in the slight relaxation of her shoulders. "We've spoken with Dr. Patel. She's receiving excellent care." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Matthew knew he should thank them for the insurance coverage, but the words stuck in his throat. Their generosity came with strings, always had. Richard cleared his throat. "Victoria and I have been discussing Sophie's situation. We believe it would be best if she came to stay with us until she's fully recovered. The estate has better air quality than that old house, and our housekeeper can be with her during the day while you're teaching." And there it was, the price of their help, the opening move in a game Matthew had no interest in playing. "She's coming home with me. Her brother is waiting for her, and she needs the stability of her own space." "Matthew, be reasonable." Victoria's voice took on the condescending tone he'd grown to dread. "That house is probably what made her sick in the first place. Old pipes, poor ventilation, who knows what kind of mold in the walls." "That house is her home," Matthew said quietly. "Our home. And it's where she'll recover with her family." Richard's expression hardened. "We are her family too, and we have resources you simply don't." "I appreciate the insurance," Matthew said, forcing civility into his tone. "Truly, but Sophie stays with us." "This isn't over," Victoria said, her voice low enough that the passing nurses wouldn't hear. "We've been patient, Matthew, but seeing Sophie in this condition, it's clear you're in over your head. You can expect to hear from our attorney." As they walked away, their designer shoes clicking on the hospital's linoleum floor, Matthew felt a familiar mix of anger and fear. The Hamiltons wielded their wealth like a weapon, and he had no comparable arsenal. All he had was the truth of who he was, who Olivia had believed him to be. He hoped it would be enough. That evening, as he sat beside Sophie's bed, helping her with a drawing she insisted on finishing before sleep, Matthew found himself studying his daughter's face, the determined set of her jaw so like her mother's, the thoughtful eyes that saw more than most adults. What would happen if the Hamiltons made good on their threat, if they took him to court for custody or even visitation rights? The legal fees alone would devastate him, and that was before considering the influence the Hamilton name carried in this city. "What's wrong, Daddy?" Sophie asked, looking up from her sketchbook. "You look worried." Matthew forced a smile. "Just thinking about getting you home tomorrow. Noah's been rearranging your room to make it more healing, whatever that means." Sophie giggled, a sound that eased some of the tightness in Matthew's chest. "He probably put all my books in rainbow order again." "Probably." Matthew smoothed her hair back from her forehead, relieved that her fever hadn't returned. "Get some sleep, sweetheart. Big day tomorrow." After Sophie drifted off, Matthew stepped into the hallway to call James and update him on the plan to bring Sophie home. As he ended the call, a woman in a tailored suit approached her heels, making no sound on the hospital floor. "Mr. Reed, I'm Victoria Harris from Caldwell Bishop and Associates." She extended a business card. "I've been trying to reach you regarding an important legal matter concerning your late wife, Olivia Reed." Matthew stared at the card, his exhaustion making it difficult to process what was happening. "What sort of legal matter?" "I prefer not to discuss the details here." "Would you be available to meet at our offices tomorrow afternoon, say 4 o'clock? It's imperative that we speak as soon as possible, Mr. Reed. This concerns matters with significant time sensitivity." "I'm bringing my daughter home from the hospital tomorrow. I can't—" "I understand completely," Ms. Harris said, her tone softening slightly. "Family comes first. However, this matter directly impacts your family's future. Perhaps we could meet briefly at your home once your daughter is settled." Something in her manner, professional but not intimidating, respectful of his priorities, made Matthew reconsider. "All right, tomorrow evening after 7, the children will be in bed by then." "Perfect. And Mr. Reed, this is not about the Hamiltons' custody interests. I represent a different party entirely." As she walked away, Matthew wondered what new complication was about to enter their lives. He had a fleeting wild hope that perhaps Olivia had left them something after all. Some small inheritance or keepsake that had been overlooked in the chaos after her death. But he quickly dismissed the thought. If there had been anything of value, the Hamiltons would have known about it and used it as leverage already. Whatever this Victoria Harris wanted to discuss, Matthew doubted it would solve the fundamental problem the Hamiltons had: resources, connections, and a lifetime of getting their way. If they decided to pursue legal action for Sophie and Noah, the battle would be exhausting and expensive. And Matthew wasn't sure he could win. The next day, Matthew brought Sophie home to a hero's welcome. Noah had indeed rearranged her room, but he'd also enlisted the help of their neighbors. Mrs. Kim from the corner store had contributed a homemade quilt in Sophie's favorite colors. Gabriel Santos, the contractor who lived 2 doors down, had fixed a previously overlooked draft in her window. Even Eleanor Murphy, their elderly neighbor who had once been Olivia's elementary school teacher, had stopped by with chicken soup and fresh bread. "The neighborhood looks after its own," Eleanor said as she helped Matthew settle Sophie on the living room couch. "You'll find that out soon enough. We may not have much individually, but together we make do." The simple kindness of these near strangers brought a lump to Matthew's throat. This was what the Hamiltons couldn't understand with their wealth and isolation, that community wasn't about what you owned, but about what you gave. At precisely 7 o'clock, Victoria Harris arrived at the house on Oak Street. She took in the peeling paint and sagging porch with a neutral expression that neither judged nor pitied. Matthew appreciated her professionalism as he led her to the kitchen table, the only space in the house suitable for a business meeting. "Thank you for accommodating me on such short notice, Mr. Reed. I represent the Ellington Trust, a private foundation established by your wife's maternal grandmother, Margaret Ellington. Are you familiar with Mrs. Ellington?" "Olivia spoke of her grandmother often, but I never met her. She passed away before Olivia and I met." "Did Olivia ever discuss her grandmother's financial legacy?" Matthew thought carefully, remembering snippets of conversations and the journal entry he'd read just after the eviction. She mentioned that her grandmother had views about money that differed from the Hamiltons, that she believed in using wealth purposefully rather than accumulating it for its own sake. But she never discussed specific inheritances or trusts. Victoria made a note in her folder, her expression revealing nothing. Mrs. Ellington established the trust in 1985. Us with explicit instructions regarding its management and eventual distribution. The principle was to remain untouched until certain conditions were met. Olivia was named as the primary beneficiary upon reaching the age of 30, provided she demonstrated what Mrs. Ellington termed a life of purpose and compassion. Matthew leaned forward, his interest piqued. And did she meet the conditions? Victoria allowed a small smile. According to the trustee's evaluation, yes. Olivia was notified of her inheritance on her 30th birthday 3 years ago. The trust, valued at approximately $200 million, was placed under her sole control at that time. The words hit Matthew like a physical blow. He stared at Victoria, certain he had misheard. That's impossible. Olivia never mentioned anything about that kind of money. We lived on my professor's salary and her part-time gallery work. We budgeted for vacations saved for the children's education. If she had access to that kind of wealth, she chose not to use it for day-to-day expenses. According to our records, Olivia established the Reed Foundation immediately after gaining control of the trust. She directed that the funds be used primarily for philanthropic purposes, with specific provisions for educational initiatives, community development, and healthcare access for underserved populations. Matthew struggled to reconcile this information with the life they had lived together. Olivia secretly controlling a fortune while they clipped coupons and bought clothes on sale. Olivia establishing a foundation he'd never heard of, making decisions about millions of dollars without ever mentioning it to him. Why wouldn't she tell me? Victoria consulted another document, her expression softening slightly. That's where matters become more personal, Mr. Reed. Olivia left specific instructions regarding disclosure of the foundation and its assets. According to her directives, you were to be informed of its existence exactly 1 year after her death, provided certain conditions were met. What conditions? Separation from the Hamilton family's influence, establishment of an independent household, demonstration of, and I'm quoting directly from her instructions, continued commitment to the values we shared throughout our marriage, particularly regarding the children's upbringing. The realization dawned slowly then, all at once. Olivia had anticipated everything: her parents' attempt to control the children, Matthew's displacement from their home, the financial struggles that would follow. She had orchestrated a test, a proving ground for the principles they had built their marriage upon. She knew this would happen. She knew her parents would try to take the children, that they'd use money as leverage. Victoria nodded. Based on my conversations with Olivia during the establishment of the foundation, yes, she was concerned that her parents' wealth would influence the children's values if they were raised in the Hamilton household. She was equally concerned that you might compromise your principles if offered financial security in exchange for certain concessions regarding their upbringing. Anger flared briefly in Matthew's chest, anger that Olivia had kept such secrets, that she had orchestrated this elaborate test without his knowledge or consent. But the anger faded as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a deeper understanding of the woman he had loved. Olivia, who had grown up witnessing the corrosive effects of unearned wealth and privilege. Olivia, who had chosen a life of purpose and meaning over one of luxury and ease. Olivia, who had wanted to ensure that their children would inherit values, not just money. What happens now? Victoria opened another folder, revealing a document bearing Olivia's familiar signature. Now, as the surviving parent and legal guardian of Noah and Sophie Reed, you become the primary trustee of the Reed Foundation. Olivia specified that the children would become co-trustees upon reaching the age of 21 and assuming they demonstrate the same values the foundation was established to promote. Until then, all decisions regarding the management and distribution of assets rest with you. Matthew ran a hand through his hair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the responsibility Olivia had entrusted to him. I don't know anything about running a foundation. I'm a history professor, not a financial manager. The foundation has a professional management team in place with clear guidelines established by Olivia. Your role would be oversight and direction, ensuring that the foundation's activities align with its stated mission. Additionally, there are provisions for your family's financial security, a modest but comfortable stipend to cover living expenses, educational costs for the children, and healthcare needs. And the Hamiltons, do they know about this? Victoria's expression turned carefully neutral. The Hamiltons are aware of Mrs. Ellington's trust. They were explicitly excluded from any control or influence over its assets by the terms of Mrs. Ellington's will. However, they are not aware of Olivia's specific directives regarding the Reed Foundation or the timing of your appointment as trustee. I need time to process this. Of course, these documents outline the foundation's current activities, assets, and legal structure. I'd encourage you to review them at your convenience. There's no immediate deadline for your formal acceptance of the trustee position, though there are quarterly distributions scheduled that would benefit from your input. As Victoria Harris left, the weight of Olivia's revelation pressed against Matthew's chest, a complex mixture of gratitude, betrayal, and disbelief. He had lived the past year in a state of near constant financial anxiety, working 3 jobs to keep their heads above water, while a fortune waited in trust. Its revelation depended on his adherence to principles he would have maintained regardless. In the quiet house with his children sleeping safely in their beds, Matthew opened the folder Victoria had left. The first page bore the Reed Foundation logo, a simple design incorporating a paintbrush and an open book, symbols of Olivia's art and his scholarship. Beneath it was a mission statement in Olivia's distinctive handwriting: to nurture communities where every child has the opportunity to discover their worth beyond material measures. Matthew traced the words with his finger, feeling Olivia's presence in each curve and line. She had created something remarkable, not just a financial legacy, but a vision for how that wealth could serve the values they shared. She had trusted him to bring that vision to life, even as she tested his commitment to those same values. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Hamiltons had tried to use their wealth to control him, and the children believing that financial security would be an irresistible lure. Meanwhile, Olivia had arranged for him to control a fortune far greater than anything the Hamiltons could offer, but only after he had proven that money wasn't what motivated him. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the old house on Oak Street. The repairs they'd made held firm: the new weather stripping Matthew had installed, the reinforced window frames, the sealed gaps in the flooring. They had built something here, something that couldn't be measured in dollars or square footage. And now, with the resources of the Reed Foundation at their disposal, they could build something even greater, not just for themselves, but for others who needed the same kind of support they had found in this unlikely community. Matthew closed the folder and placed it on the kitchen table beside Olivia's wedding ring. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of understanding what it meant to be the trustee of a $200 million foundation. Tonight, he was simply a father who had kept his promise to his wife, to his children, and to himself. Whatever challenges the Hamiltons might still present, he would face them with the full legal authority Olivia had intended him to have, backed by the resources she had provided and guided by the principles they had shared. As he checked on Noah and Sophie one last time before bed, Matthew realized that Olivia had given them far more than money. She had given them the opportunity to define success on their own terms, to build a life based on meaning rather than status. And in doing so, she had ensured that her children would inherit her true legacy, not the wealth of the Ellington Trust, but the wisdom to know what really mattered. 3 months into their new life, Matthew discovered that poverty was less about not having money and more about the constant mental mathematics of survival. He could tell you the exact cost of a gallon of milk at 3 different stores, knew which day the bakery marked down day-old bread, and had memorized the bus schedule that would get him between home, the university, and his 2 part-time jobs with minimal transfers. Mornings began at 5:30 with preparation for his early classes at the university. Afternoons found him at the local museum, cataloging war artifacts for a special exhibition. Evenings were reserved for tutoring high school students in their affluent homes, where he sat at kitchen islands that cost more than his monthly rent and helped teenagers understand the historical significance of events that suddenly felt very personal. The teaching award from the university sat propped against the windowsill in his makeshift home office, a dusty corner of the living room where he graded papers by lamplight. The engraved plaque read, "Matthew Reed Excellence in Education 2020. Sometimes when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, he would look at those words and remember who he had been before grief and circumstance had redefined his life. Noah and Sophie adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience that children possess but shouldn't need to use. They enrolled at Jefferson Middle School, a public institution that bore no resemblance to the private academies the Hamiltons had preferred. The building was older, the resources limited, but the teachers cared deeply about their students' success. Sophie struggled most with the transition. She had inherited Olivia's sensitive nature, along with her artistic talent, in the chaos of their new reality manifested in her drawings. Where she had once sketched flowers and family portraits, her recent work featured dark, swirling storms and houses that looked perpetually on the verge of collapse. "She's processing," explained Mrs. Rivera, the school counselor, when Matthew came for a conference. "Children often express their emotions through art before they can verbalize them. The important thing is that she's still creating." Noah, meanwhile, had appointed himself the family's unofficial guardian. He walked Sophie to her classes, helped her carry her art supplies, and deflected questions from curious classmates about why they had moved. At home, he insisted on helping with dinner preparation and household chores, his small face serious with self-imposed responsibility. "You don't have to take care of everything," Matthew told him one evening as they repaired a loose floorboard together. "Mom said families help each other," Noah replied, not looking up from the hammer he was wielding with careful precision. "This is how I help." Their new neighborhood was a study in contrasts. Some houses were well-maintained with tidy yards and fresh paint. Others, like theirs, showed the accumulated wear of deferred maintenance and economic struggle. But there was a sense of community here that had been absent from their previous life. Neighbors who checked on each other, children who played in the streets without scheduled supervision, families who understood that wealth wasn't measured solely in dollars. James lived across town but visited regularly with books for the children and practical advice for Matthew. He appeared one Saturday with tools and lumber, insisting that the front steps couldn't wait for the landlord's attention. "People think poverty is about lacking things," he told Matthew as they worked, "but it's really about lacking choices. The trick is making sure your children understand the difference." The house itself was slowly yielding to their efforts. Matthew had discovered a talent for renovation that surprised him. Weekends were devoted to painting walls, fixing leaky faucets, and coaxing life back into rooms that had been neglected for too long. Sophie chose colors for her bedroom, soft blues and greens that reminded her of her mother's garden. Noah preferred practical improvements, better lighting for homework shelves for his books, a workspace where he could build the model airplanes that had become his latest passion. Their first small victory came when Matthew managed to repair the front steps. He had salvaged lumber from a construction site and spent an entire Saturday measuring, cutting, and hammering. When he finished, the steps were level and sturdy, a small improvement that felt monumental. "They look like real steps now," Sophie observed, testing them carefully. "They are real steps," Matthew replied, wiping sweat from his forehead, "built to last." That evening, as they sat on their newly repaired front porch eating ice cream cones James had brought over, Matthew felt something he hadn't experienced since Olivia's death. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, that seemed too ambitious, but a quiet sense of accomplishment. The financial pressure was constant but manageable. Matthew's 3 jobs provided enough income to cover rent, utilities, groceries, and basic necessities. There was no money for extras, no family vacations, restaurant meals, or new clothes unless absolutely necessary. But they weren't hungry and they weren't homeless. And some days that felt like prosperity. In the weeks following Victoria Harris's revelation about the Ellington Trust in the Reed Foundation, Matthew had been carefully reviewing the documents she'd left behind. The Foundation's mission to nurture communities where every child could discover their worth beyond material measures resonated deeply with him. But the responsibility of managing $200 million was overwhelming for a history professor with no financial expertise. The quarterly board meeting was approaching, and Matthew needed to decide whether to formally accept the position as trustee. If he did, it would mean significant changes for their family. The Foundation's stipend would allow him to quit his extra jobs and focus on teaching and parenting. The children could have new clothes, better food, perhaps even a few modest luxuries. But with those benefits came questions that kept him awake at night. Would financial security change who they were becoming? Would the values they were learning through struggle, resourcefulness, gratitude, community, be compromised by comfort? And what would the Hamiltons do when they discovered his new position? "You've been staring at that same page for 20 minutes, said Eleanor Murphy, appearing in the doorway with a cup of tea. The elderly former teacher had become a regular visitor, often arriving with homemade food and staying to help with homework or household projects. "Decisions don't get easier just because you stare at them longer." Matthew smiled ruefully, voice of experience. 40 years in the classroom, I've seen a lot of staring that didn't lead to answers. She settled into the chair across from him, her movements careful but not frail. "What's troubling you?" Matthew hesitated. He hadn't shared the details of Olivia's inheritance with anyone except James. The fewer people who knew, the less chance the information would reach the Hamiltons before he was ready to deal with them. But something about Eleanor, her quiet wisdom, her connection to Olivia's past made him want to confide in her. If you had the chance to make your children's lives significantly easier, but you weren't sure if easier was better for them in the long run, what would you do? Eleanor studied him over the rim of her teacup. This is about money, I take it, something Olivia left behind. Matthew's surprise must have shown on his face because Eleanor chuckled softly. I've been around long enough to recognize the signs of a financial dilemma. Besides, Olivia was Margaret Ellington's granddaughter. I always wondered if that connection would surface eventually. You knew her grandmother. This is a small town beneath the big city, Matthew. Margaret Ellington funded the arts program at my school for 20 years. Brilliant woman, believed money was a tool, not a trophy. I see a lot of her in Olivia and in Sophie. Matthew found himself telling Eleanor everything to trust. The foundation, Olivia's test, his fears about how wealth might change their carefully reconstructed lives. So you're afraid that having financial security will somehow corrupt the values you're trying to instill? Eleanor summarized when he finished. That comfort will breed complacency. Not exactly, Matthew said, struggling to articulate his concern. I'm afraid of taking the easy path just because it's easy. Olivia and I agreed that we wanted the children to understand the value of things, to know that the most important aspects of life can't be purchased. These past months have been difficult, but they've also been genuine. We've built something real here, something that money didn't buy. Eleanor nodded slowly. And you think accepting this inheritance would make that less real? Wouldn't it? Did having money make Olivia's love for you less genuine? Did it make her art less meaningful or her kindness less sincere? Matthew considered this. No, she never let money define her. Then perhaps the question isn't whether to accept the foundation's resources, but how to use them in a way that aligns with your values. Eleanor's eyes crinkled with gentle humor. Besides, there's something to be said for not having to work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. The children need their father present, not just financially providing. Before Matthew could respond, the front door burst open and Sophie rushed in, her face flushed with excitement despite the cold November air. Dad, Ms. Rivera says I can be in the winter art showcase. They chose my painting of our house. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Matthew pulled her into a hug, breathing in the scent of tempera paint and chalk dust that seemed to follow her home from the art program each day. She says I need special paper for the final version and maybe some better paints. Sophie's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. But I told her we could use what we have. It's okay, right? Matthew met Eleanor's knowing gaze over Sophie's head. The moment crystallized his dilemma perfectly. His daughter's talent, deserving resources, they couldn't easily provide her awareness of their limitations already shaping her expectations. We'll figure it out, he promised. Your art is important. After Sophie bounded upstairs to start her homework, Eleanor rose to leave. For what it's worth, she said, gathering her coat. I think Olivia trusted you with this decision for a reason. She knew you would weigh it carefully, that you wouldn't simply take the easy path because it was easy. Matthew nodded, grateful for her insight. I just wish she had trusted me enough to tell me about it while she was alive. Perhaps she was protecting you both from her parents' interference and from having to make difficult choices during an already impossible time. Eleanor paused at the door. Olivia chose love over wealth once when she married you. Now she's given you the chance to show that the two aren't mutually exclusive. After Eleanor left, Matthew returned to the foundation documents with new clarity. The mission Olivia had established, supporting children's education, arts programs, community development in underserved areas, aligned perfectly with their shared values. The quarterly stipend would provide comfort without excess security, without luxury. And most importantly, it would give him time to be present for Noah and Sophie, time to heal as a family, time to build a future that honored Olivia's memory. The next morning, Matthew called Victoria Harris and officially accepted the position as trustee of the Reed Foundation. Whatever challenges lay ahead with the Hamiltons, he would face them with the full legal authority Olivia had intended him to have, backed by the resources she had provided and guided by the principles they had shared. One crisp October morning, Sophie woke with a high fever. By afternoon, her breathing had become labored, and Matthew rushed her to the emergency room. The diagnosis was severe pneumonia complicated by an underlying respiratory condition they hadn't known about. As Sophie was admitted to the pediatric ward, Matthew felt a surge of panic that had nothing to do with her medical condition and everything to do with his financial reality. Their health insurance was basic at best, a high-deductible plan that would cover catastrophic events, but leave them with thousands in out-of-pocket expenses for something like this. "We'll need your insurance information," the admitting nurse said gently, sensing his distress. Matthew fumbled in his wallet for the card, his mind racing with calculations. The emergency room visit alone would wipe out their small savings. If Sophie needed to stay overnight, "Here," he said, handing over the card with a sinking heart. The nurse swiped it through her reader, looked at the screen, and smiled. "You're all set, Mr. Reed. This is a comprehensive plan with no deductible for pediatric care. Sophie's treatment is fully covered, including any medications she'll need when she goes home." Matthew stared at her in confusion. "That can't be right. We have the basic university plan." "Not according to this. Your family is covered under the Hamilton Elite Health Plan. It's one of the best policies we see." She turned the screen so he could see the information. "It shows active coverage through 2035. Before Matthew could process this information, the pediatrician arrived to discuss Sophie's treatment. The immediate crisis demanded his full attention, but as he sat beside his daughter's hospital bed that night, watching her sleep beneath the oxygen mask, the mystery of the insurance nagged at him. He had never purchased a premium health plan, couldn't have afforded it on his salary, and the Hamilton name connected to the policy suggested something he hardly dared consider. On the third day of Sophie's hospitalization, Matthew returned home briefly to shower and bring her fresh clothes. While searching through her backpack for the stuffed rabbit she'd requested, he found a small envelope he had never seen before. Inside was an insurance card in Sophie's name and a note in Olivia's handwriting. "For emergencies, both children are covered. Don't worry about the can." Sitting on Sophie's bed, the card trembling in his hands, Matthew felt a rush of emotions: gratitude, confusion, and a hint of betrayal. Olivia had arranged this without telling him, had somehow maintained a connection to her family's resources while letting him believe they were living independently. Why keep it secret? Why not share that this safety net existed? The answer came to him slowly as he looked around Sophie's room at the watercolor paintings taped to the walls, the bookshelf he'd built from scrap lumber, the curtains sewn from fabric remnants. Olivia had wanted their children to know the value of things, to understand that love and creativity mattered more than material possessions. If Matthew had known about the premium insurance, would he have felt the same urgency to build this life from scratch? Or would he have relied more on the safety net, compromised more with the Hamiltons, allowed their influence to seep into the family's daily existence? When he returned to the hospital, Victoria and Richard Hamilton were standing outside Sophie's room, deep in conversation with her doctor. Matthew stopped short, his heart racing. He hadn't contacted them about Sophie's illness, had deliberately avoided doing so, fearing they would use the situation to reassert control. Victoria saw him first, her elegant features composing themselves into an expression of concern. "Matthew, we came as soon as we heard." "How did you hear?" The question came out more sharply than he intended. "The insurance company notified us," Richard explained, "as policy administrators." "Of course. The policy was in their name, probably part of a corporate package for Hamilton Industries executives. They would have been alerted when a major claim was filed." "How is she?" Victoria asked, and Matthew heard genuine worry in her voice. "Improving. They're talking about releasing her tomorrow if her oxygen levels stay up." Victoria nodded, relief visible in the slight relaxation of her shoulders. "We've spoken with Dr. Patel. She's receiving excellent care." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Matthew knew he should thank them for the insurance coverage, but the words stuck in his throat. Their generosity came with strings, always had. Richard cleared his throat. "Victoria and I have been discussing Sophie's situation. We believe it would be best if she came to stay with us until she's fully recovered. The estate has better air quality than that old house, and our housekeeper can be with her during the day while you're teaching." And there it was, the price of their help, the opening move in a game Matthew had no interest in playing. "She's coming home with me. Her brother is waiting for her, and she needs the stability of her own space." "Matthew, be reasonable." Victoria's voice took on the condescending tone he'd grown to dread. "That house is probably what made her sick in the first place. Old pipes, poor ventilation, who knows what kind of mold in the walls." "That house is her home," Matthew said quietly. "Our home, and it's where she'll recover with her family." Richard's expression hardened. "We are her family too, and we have resources you simply don't." "I appreciate the insurance," Matthew said, forcing civility into his tone. "Truly, but Sophie stays with us." "This isn't over," Victoria said, her voice low enough that the passing nurses wouldn't hear. "We've been patient, Matthew, but seeing Sophie in this condition, it's clear you're in over your head. You can expect to hear from our attorney." As they walked away, their designer shoes clicking on the hospital's linoleum floor, Matthew felt a familiar mix of anger and fear. The Hamiltons wielded their wealth like a weapon, and he had no comparable arsenal. All he had was the truth of who he was, who Olivia had believed him to be. He hoped it would be enough. That evening, as he sat beside Sophie's bed, helping her with a drawing she insisted on finishing before sleep, Matthew found himself studying his daughter's face, the determined set of her jaw, so like her mother's, the thoughtful eyes that saw more than most adults. What would happen if the Hamiltons made good on their threat, if they took him to court for custody or even visitation rights? The legal fees alone would devastate him, and that was before considering the influence the Hamilton name carried in the city. The next day, Matthew brought Sophie home to a hero's welcome. Noah had indeed rearranged her room, but he'd also enlisted the help of their neighbors. Mrs. Kim from the corner store had contributed a homemade quilt in Sophie's favorite colors. Gabriel Santos, the contractor who lived 2 doors down, had fixed a previously overlooked draft in her window. Even Eleanor Murphy had stopped by with chicken soup and fresh bread. "The neighborhood looks after its own," Eleanor said as she helped Matthew settle Sophie on the living room couch. "You'll find that out soon enough. We may not have much individually, but together we make do." The simple kindness of these near strangers brought a lump to Matthew's throat. This was what the Hamiltons couldn't understand with their wealth and isolation, that community wasn't about what you owned, but about what you gave. 2 days after Sophie's return home, Matthew received a thick envelope from the Hamiltons' attorney. The formal language couldn't disguise the message. Richard and Victoria Hamilton were petitioning the court for scheduled visitation with their grandchildren, citing their substantial role in the children's lives before Olivia's death, and their ability to provide enrichment opportunities that Matthew could not afford. Matthew's hands shook as he read the document. The Hamiltons had moved faster than he'd expected, leveraging Sophie's illness as evidence of the precarious living conditions at the Oak Street house. The petition requested 1 weekend per month at the Hamilton estate, plus 1 dinner per week, and the right to enroll the children in supplemental educational activities of the Hamiltons' choosing. On the surface, it didn't seem unreasonable. Most grandparents would be granted at least that much access to their grandchildren. But Matthew knew it was just the beginning. Once they had their foot in the door, the Hamiltons would gradually increase their demands, using their wealth and influence to reshape the children's lives according to their values. He called Victoria Harris, immediately forwarding her a copy of the petition. "How do I fight this?" "You may not need to fight," she replied after reviewing the document. "Now that you've formally accepted the position as trustee of the Reed Foundation, you have significant resources at your disposal. The Hamiltons are operating under the assumption that you're a struggling single father with limited means. They don't know about the foundation yet. I'd rather not use money to solve this problem." Matthew said, the irony of his position not lost on him. "It feels like playing their game by their rules." "Sometimes you have to use the tools available to you," Victoria said pragmatically. "I'll prepare a response that hints at your new financial position without revealing the full extent of the foundation's assets. That might be enough to make them reconsider their approach." But Matthew wasn't convinced. The Hamiltons' desire to control their grandchildren's upbringing went beyond financial considerations. They truly believed their way of life was superior, that their values, status, achievement, social position should take precedence over the principles Matthew and Olivia had tried to instill. No, this conflict wouldn't be resolved with legal maneuvers or financial revelations. It would require finding common ground, a way forward that acknowledged the Hamiltons' genuine love for their grandchildren while preserving the family Matthew and Olivia had created. As Matthew pondered this challenge, Sophie's recovery continued steadily. Her energy returned, and with it, her artistic drive. One afternoon, Matthew found her in her bedroom, struggling to reach beneath a loose floorboard near her closet. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" he asked, kneeling to help her. "Looking for something Mom gave me," Sophie explained, her face flushed with effort. "I need it for my painting." Together, they pried up the floorboard, revealing a hidden space beneath. Inside was a wooden box, lacquered mahogany, expensive and elegant, with Sophie Elizabeth Reed engraved on a small brass plate. Matthew had never seen it before. Sophie opened it reverently, revealing professional-grade watercolors, charcoal pencils, and brushes that cost more than Matthew spent on groceries in a week, each nestled in a custom-fitted compartment. "Mom bought them for me," Sophie explained when Matthew asked, her voice small with worry. "She said they were for when I was ready to create something important. I was saving them." Matthew lifted out a tube of ultramarine blue, feeling its weight and quality. Olivia had chosen each item, carefully investing in tools that would last a lifetime. The gesture was so typical of his wife planning for a future she wouldn't see, ensuring their daughter would have what she needed to pursue her dreams. "I think you're ready now," he said gently. "Mom would want you to use them." That afternoon, Sophie set up her easel in the backyard and began to paint. Her first piece was tentative, a simple landscape of their street with its modest houses and towering oak trees. But as the days passed, her confidence grew. She painted their house before and after Matthew's renovations, capturing the transformation from neglect to care. She painted Noah building a birdhouse, his tongue poking out in concentration. She painted Matthew reading on the front porch, looking peaceful in a way that surprised him. The art supplies became a bridge between Sophie's past and present, a tangible reminder that some gifts transcended loss. When she worked with them, she spoke to her mother, quiet conversations about color choices and composition that Matthew pretended not to overhear. It was healing for her and for him too, watching Olivia's legacy live on in their daughter's hands. 3 weeks after Sophie's hospitalization, Matthew received a formal summons to appear in family court for a preliminary hearing on the Hamiltons' visitation petition. Victoria Harris had filed their response, but the judge wanted to meet with all parties before making any decisions. The prospect of facing the Hamiltons in court filled Matthew with dread. He had never been comfortable with confrontation in the formal setting, would only amplify the power imbalance between them. The Hamiltons would arrive with their expensive attorneys and impeccable reputations, while he would stand alone, a teacher out of his depth in legal proceedings. "You won't be alone," James assured him over coffee in Matthew's kitchen. "The Foundation's legal team will be there, and I'll come too if you want moral support." "I appreciate that," Matthew said, "but I'm not sure more lawyers are the answer. This isn't just about legal rights or financial resources. It's about what kind of relationship the children should have with their grandparents, what role the Hamiltons should play in their lives." "What are you thinking?" Matthew had been considering this question carefully. Despite their controlling nature and questionable methods, the Hamiltons were Sophie and Noah's only living grandparents. They had loved Olivia in their way, and they genuinely cared about their grandchildren. Cutting them out entirely wouldn't be right or healthy for anyone. "I'm thinking it might be better to try to reach an understanding outside of court. Find a compromise that respects our family's autonomy, but still allows the Hamiltons to be part of the children's lives in a limited way." James nodded thoughtfully. "That's mature of you, considering how they've treated you." "It's not about me," Matthew said. "It's about what's best for Noah and Sophie in the long run." The next day, Matthew called the Hamiltons' lawyer and requested a meeting with Victoria and Richard before the court date. The attorney seemed surprised but agreed to arrange it. 2 days later, Matthew found himself sitting across from his former in-laws in a conference room at their attorney's office, the polished mahogany table between them, a physical manifestation of their differences. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Matthew began, determined to set a conciliatory tone. "I think we all want what's best for Noah and Sophie, even if we sometimes disagree about what that means." Victoria's expression remained guarded, but Richard nodded slightly, a small acknowledgement of Matthew's olive branch. "I understand your desire to be part of their lives," Matthew continued. "You're their grandparents and you loved Olivia. The children need that connection to their mother's family and heritage." "Then why are you fighting our petition?" Victoria asked, her voice clipped. "We're only asking for reasonable visitation." "Because the petition is just the beginning," Matthew said honestly. "We both know that once you have court-ordered access, you'll use it to gradually increase your influence to try to reshape their lives according to your values, rather than the ones Olivia and I chose for them." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but didn't deny it. "I'm not here to argue about the past," Matthew said. "I'm here to propose an alternative that might work for all of us." He took a deep breath. "Monthly family dinners at our home on Oak Street, where you can spend time with Noah and Sophie in their environment. Occasional day visits to the estate, perhaps once every 2 months with me present, at least initially. As the children become more comfortable, we can reevaluate." Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. "And their education, Jefferson Middle School, hardly prepares them for the opportunities their heritage should afford them. The Reed Foundation can fund enrichment activities beyond what Jefferson offers," Matthew said, watching their reaction carefully. "Private music lessons, advanced art instruction for Sophie, additional math and science programs for Noah. They get the educational enhancement without sacrificing the community that's helped them heal." Victoria and Richard exchanged a look of confusion. The Reed Foundation, Richard asked. Matthew hadn't planned to reveal his connection to the foundation so soon, but the opportunity presented itself naturally. Yes, Olivia established it 3 years ago through her grandmother's trust. I was recently appointed trustee. The shock on their faces would have been satisfying under different circumstances. Richard recovered first, his businessman's mind quickly calculating the implications. Margaret Ellington's trust. I should have known Olivia would find a way to access it independently. She did more than access it, Matthew said. She created something meaningful with it, a foundation dedicated to the values she believed in, values she wanted her children to inherit. Victoria's composure slipped, genuine emotion briefly visible beneath her carefully maintained facade. She never told us. All these years we thought that she needed your financial support, that I couldn't provide for her. Matthew filled in the blank. Olivia chose a different path. She believed wealth was a tool, not a measure of worth. She wanted her children to understand the difference. A heavy silence filled the room as the Hamiltons processed this revelation. Matthew had just fundamentally altered the power dynamic between them, not by brandishing his new financial authority, but by revealing the truth of Olivia's choices. "We'll need to discuss your proposal," Victoria said, finally, her voice lacking its usual certainty, "and verify the information about this foundation." Of course, Victoria Harris at Caldwell Bishop and Associates can provide all the necessary documentation. Matthew rose to leave, feeling strangely light despite the tension of the meeting. "I hope we can find a way forward that honors Olivia's memory and supports Noah and Sophie's well-being. That's what she would have wanted for all of us." In the days that followed, Matthew waited anxiously for the Hamiltons' response. He had revealed his connection to the Reed Foundation earlier than planned, and he wasn't sure how they would react once they confirmed the truth of his claim. Would they intensify their legal battle, seeing the foundation as rightfully theirs to control? Or would the revelation that Olivia had deliberately kept them at arm's length from her inheritance cause them to reconsider their approach? The answer came on a cold November evening as Matthew helped Noah with his science project at the kitchen table. A sleek black car pulled up outside their house, its headlights briefly illuminating the front window before going dark. A moment later, there was a knock at the door. Victoria Hamilton stood on the porch alone, her elegant wool coat buttoned against the chill. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual imperious tone. Matthew hesitated, then stepped aside to let her enter. Noah looked up from his project, his expression wary but curious. "Grandma." "Hello, Noah," Victoria said, a small smile softening her features. "That looks like an impressive project." "It's a scale model of the solar system," Noah explained, his natural enthusiasm temporarily overriding his caution. "Dad helped me calculate the relative distances between the planets." Victoria nodded, genuinely interested. "Your mother was fascinated by astronomy when she was about your age. She had glow-in-the-dark stars all over her ceiling arranged in actual constellations." Noah's eyes widened. "Really, Mom never told me that." "There are many things about your mother you don't know yet," Victoria said, a hint of sadness in her voice. "Perhaps that's something we could change." Matthew cleared his throat. "Noah, why don't you continue working upstairs? I need to speak with your grandmother privately." Once Noah had gathered his materials and headed upstairs, Matthew gestured Victoria to a seat at the kitchen table. "Would you like some tea?" "Thank you, no." Victoria placed her handbag precisely on the table, her movements betraying her discomfort with the humble surroundings. "I verified your information about the Reed Foundation. It seems Olivia was more independent than we realized." "She valued her autonomy," Matthew agreed, "but she also valued family. She never wanted to cut you out of the children's lives completely, just to establish boundaries that respected her choices." Victoria's gaze traveled around the kitchen, taking in the mismatched chairs, the secondhand appliances, the carefully patched ceiling. "You've done remarkably well with this place, considering its condition when you arrived." The compliment, unexpected and seemingly genuine, caught Matthew off guard. "Thank you. It's been a group effort. The neighbors have been incredibly supportive." "Yes, I can see that." Victoria hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Richard and I have discussed your proposal. We're prepared to accept your terms regarding visitation. With one addition, we would like the children to spend 1 week during the summer at the estate with you. Welcome to join them if you wish." Matthew considered this. A week was substantial but not unreasonable, and the invitation for him to join them suggested a level of respect he hadn't expected. "I think that could work, provided the children are comfortable with it." Victoria nodded, relief briefly visible in her expression. "I've instructed our attorney to withdraw the court petition. We'd prefer to handle this as a family matter. I appreciate that. Matthew studied his former mother-in-law, trying to understand the shift in her approach. May I ask what changed your mind? Victoria was silent for a long moment, her hands folded precisely in her lap. When we confirmed the existence of the Reed Foundation and Olivia's role in establishing it, I realized something I should have understood years ago. Olivia wasn't rejecting us or her heritage when she chose this life with you. She was defining success on her own terms, just as her grandmother had done. She looked up, meeting Matthew's gaze directly. Margaret Ellington was a formidable woman. She married against her family's wishes during the Depression, built a business when few women dared to try, and established that trust specifically to protect her descendants from the kind of financial control her own parents had attempted to exert. I should have recognized the pattern sooner. Olivia loved you, Matthew said gently. She was grateful for the privileges she had growing up, but she wanted to define success on her own terms, to build a life based on meaning rather than status. That's the legacy she wanted for Noah and Sophie, the freedom to determine their own values rather than inheriting them without question. For a moment, Victoria's carefully maintained facade faltered, revealing the grief she typically kept hidden beneath layers of control and composure. I miss her every day. The children are all we have left of her. They're not extensions of Olivia, Matthew said quietly. They're their own people with their own paths to discover. Loving them means supporting who they are becoming, not just preserving who they remind you of. The truth of the statement hung between them, uncomfortable but necessary. Victoria straightened her shoulders, her moment of vulnerability passing as quickly as it had appeared. Well, I should be going. I'll have my assistant call to arrange our first dinner. Would Sunday next week be convenient? That would be fine. The children will be pleased. As Victoria rose to leave, she paused, her expression uncharacteristically uncertain. One question, Matthew. If the foundation hadn't existed, if you were truly struggling financially as we believed, would your decision be different? Matthew considered the question honestly, understanding its importance. The financial security changes our practical circumstances, but not our values. Even without the foundation, I would prioritize the children's emotional well-being over educational prestige or social advantage. Money, or the lack of it, doesn't determine what matters most. Victoria nodded, accepting his answer with unexpected grace. Olivia chose well. The simple statement, the closest thing to approval Victoria had ever offered, lingered in the air as she departed, leaving Matthew with the sense that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. Not resolution, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. The first family dinner with the Hamiltons was predictably awkward. Victoria arrived precisely on time, bearing gifts for the children that were expensive but thoughtful: a professional sketchbook for Sophie, a telescope for Noah. Richard followed with a bottle of wine for Matthew and an obvious discomfort with the modest surroundings. The conversation was stilted, at first revolving around safe topics like the children's school activities and the weather. But as the evening progressed, small moments of genuine connection emerged. Richard discovered Noah's fascination with architecture and shared stories about historic buildings he had helped preserve through his real estate developments. Victoria watched Sophie sketch and offered gentle observations about composition and perspective that revealed her own hidden appreciation for art. By the third such dinner a month later, the initial stiffness had given way to something resembling comfortable familiarity. The children approached their grandparents with less caution, Noah proudly showing Richard his math competition medals, Sophie seeking Victoria's opinion on her latest paintings. The Hamiltons in turn made visible efforts to engage with the children on their terms rather than imposing expectations or judgments. The first-day visit to the Hamilton estate revealed similar progress. Though initially overwhelmed by the mansion's grandeur, Noah and Sophie gradually relaxed as Matthew remained steadily present, a buffer against old tensions and unspoken expectations. Richard gave them a tour of the grounds, showing particular patience with Sophie's endless questions about the garden. Victoria had arranged a small art exhibition in the conservatory, not of valuable masterpieces from their collection, but of Olivia's childhood drawings and paintings preserved with the same care as their most expensive acquisitions. She was talented even then, Victoria said softly as they studied a watercolor Olivia had painted at 12, a simple scene of the estate's garden in spring, rendered with surprising skill for such a young artist. Sophie has her eye for detail, Matthew agreed, watching his daughter examine her mother's work with intense concentration. And her determination, Victoria added a note of pride, warming her typically modulated voice. Olivia would paint the same subject dozens of times until she captured it exactly as she saw it in her mind. Sophie has that same persistence. The acknowledgement that Olivia's positive qualities lived on in her children seemed to ease something in Victoria. For perhaps the first time she was seeing Noah and Sophie not just as extensions of the Hamilton legacy or reminders of her lost daughter, but as individuals with their own unique combinations of inherited traits and developing personalities. As winter gave way to spring, the Reed Foundation began taking more concrete shape under Matthew's guidance. With Victoria Harris's help, he established clear priorities aligned with Olivia's values: educational access for underserved communities, arts programs for disadvantaged youth, community development initiatives that emphasize self-determination rather than dependence. The Foundation's first major grant funded a comprehensive after-school program at Jefferson Middle School, providing resources that benefited not just Noah and Sophie, but all their classmates. The program included art classes, music instruction, science labs, and tutoring support, the kind of enrichment the Hamiltons had wanted for their grandchildren, but offered to every child regardless of financial circumstances. Matthew invited Richard and Victoria to the program's official opening. Watching them interact with the students and teachers, seeing their genuine interest in the Foundation's work, he realized that they were beginning to understand what Olivia had tried to show them for years: that wealth's true value lay in what it could create, not what it could control. The house on Oak Street blossomed along with the season. The garden Matthew had started the previous year expanded with Eleanor's expert guidance and the children's enthusiastic assistance. The interior renovations continued room by room, each improvement making the space more truly their own. The neighborhood's collective efforts had transformed what was once a neglected property into a warm, welcoming home that reflected the family's journey from crisis to recovery. One evening in late April, as Matthew sat on the front porch watching Noah and Sophie play with their neighborhood friends in the yard, James Chen joined him, settling into the adjacent chair with the careful movements of advancing age. "You've built something remarkable here, Matthew. Not just the house, but the life inside it." Matthew smiled, watching his son teach Miguel Santos the finer points of pitching a baseball, while Sophie and several other children created an elaborate chalk mural on the sidewalk. "We built it together, the children, the neighbors' friends like you and Eleanor. I couldn't have done it alone." "That's precisely what makes it remarkable," James replied. "The Hamiltons measure success by individual achievement, wealth accumulated, status, attained power exercised. You measure it by connection, community, shared purpose. The children are learning that lesson every day, not through lectures, but through lived experience." The observation resonated with something Matthew had been reflecting on recently: the profound difference between knowing principles intellectually and embodying them through action. Noah and Sophie weren't just hearing about values like generosity, resilience, and community. They were witnessing them in practice and participating in their expression. "Do you think Olivia would be proud of what we've created here?" James's weathered face softened with certainty. "Without question. This is exactly what she hoped for, not just material security, but a life rich in meaning and connection. The Foundation provides resources, but the true inheritance she left her children is the example you're setting together, that a good life isn't measured by what you have, but by who you become and how you care for others." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek black car, different from the Hamiltons' usual vehicle. A young man in a driver's uniform emerged, approached the porch, and handed Matthew an envelope before returning to the car without a word. Inside was a formal invitation to a charity gala hosted by the Hamilton Foundation, along with a handwritten note from Victoria. "We would be honored if you and the children would attend as our guests. This is an important event for the family, and your presence would mean a great deal to us. Perhaps it's time the community met Emma's family, as it truly is not divided by grief and misunderstanding, but united in her memory." The invitation represented more than a social engagement. It was Victoria's public acknowledgement of Matthew and the children as legitimate members of the Hamilton family circle. After months of gradual relationship building through private dinners and visits, she was offering formal recognition in the social world she valued most highly. "I wasn't expecting this," Matthew admitted, showing the invitation to James. The older man studied it thoughtfully. "It's a significant gesture. Victoria is essentially declaring to her entire social circle that you and the children are acknowledged family members, not estranged relations to be hidden away. Should we accept? That depends on what you want the children to learn from the experience. There's value in understanding the world the Hamiltons inhabit, even if it's not the world you choose to center your lives around. Knowledge without judgment, exposure without absorption, these can broaden perspective without compromising values. Matthew nodded, considering James's wisdom. The invitation offered an opportunity to bridge the remaining gap between the two worlds his children inhabited, to show them that they could honor both sides of their heritage without having to choose between them. The gala was held at the city's most prestigious hotel. The grand ballroom transformed into an elegant showcase of wealth and influence. Matthew felt distinctly out of place despite his rented tuxedo, but Noah and Sophie approached the event with the natural adaptability of children curious about the unfamiliar surroundings, but grounded in their own sense of self. Victoria met them in the lobby, her expression showing genuine pleasure at their arrival. "You all look wonderful. Thank you for coming. This means a great deal to Richard and me." The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, the assembled guests representing the city's financial and social elite. As Victoria led them through the crowd, Matthew noted the curious glances, the whispered comments behind discreet hands. The Hamiltons' estranged son-in-law and grandchildren were clearly objects of interest in this rarefied environment. Richard Blackwood stood near the stage, deep in conversation with several distinguished-looking men. His face registered surprise, followed by pleasure when he spotted their approach. "Noah, Sophie, welcome to your first Hamilton Foundation Gala. And Matthew, thank you for bringing them. I wasn't certain you would accept the invitation. We thought it was important for the children to understand all aspects of their heritage." Matthew replied, his hand resting protectively on Sophie's shoulder as she gazed wide-eyed at the elaborate decorations and elegant crowd. The evening progressed with formal speeches, lavish dinner service, and carefully orchestrated social interactions. Matthew watched with a mixture of amusement and pride as his children navigated the unfamiliar protocols with remarkable grace. Sophie charming elderly patrons with her earnest questions about art. Noah engaging in surprisingly sophisticated conversation with a university president about educational philosophy. As the formal program concluded, Richard approached Matthew at their table, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "I'd like to show the children something if you'll permit it. There's an exhibition in the mezzanine gallery that I think would interest them." Matthew hesitated briefly before nodding his assent. The gradual building of trust over recent months had earned Richard this small measure of faith. The mezzanine gallery had been transformed into a memorial exhibition, Olivia Hamilton Reed, A Life in Art. Displayed with museum-quality lighting and professional curation were dozens of Olivia's works, from childhood sketches to her final paintings, each piece accompanied by a small plaque providing context and commentary, creating a comprehensive narrative of her artistic development and personal journey. Noah and Sophie moved through the exhibition in stunned silence, absorbing this unexpected window into their mother's life and talent. Matthew felt equally overwhelmed, recognizing familiar pieces that had hung in their home alongside works he had never seen, paintings from before they met, sketches from her student days, even recent works he hadn't known existed. Richard stood slightly apart, watching their reactions with careful attention. "Victoria and I have been collecting Olivia's art since she was a child. After her passing, we discovered additional pieces in her studio at the estate works she had created during her visits home, but left behind. We thought perhaps this would be a way to share her with you, to help the children understand the woman she was before she became their mother." The gesture was unexpectedly thoughtful, revealing a depth of sentiment beneath Richard's typically pragmatic exterior. He had found a way to share Olivia with her children that transcended the tensions and disagreements that had characterized their family relationships. "This is remarkable, Richard. Thank you for doing this," Matthew said, genuinely moved by the effort and care evident in the exhibition. Richard nodded, uncharacteristic emotion briefly visible in his expression. She was remarkable, stubborn, idealistic, determined to forge her own path, but remarkable nonetheless. "I didn't always understand her choices, but I never doubted her conviction or her talent." As they continued through the exhibition, they reached a section dedicated to Olivia's final works, paintings created during her illness when her body was failing, but her creative vision remained clear. Among them was a triptych titled Simply Legacy, 3 panels depicting the same landscape from different perspectives. The first showed the view from the Hamilton estate, grand and formal. The second captured the garden of the brownstone where Matthew and Olivia had raised their children. The third panel revealed a scene Matthew didn't recognize at first glance, a modest house on a tree-lined street surrounded by a vibrant community garden where adults and children worked together. She painted this just weeks before she passed, Richard explained quietly. I didn't understand it at the time. Now I think perhaps she was showing us something important, different versions of home, different kinds of legacy. The third panel confused me most of all since it wasn't any place I recognized. It's Oak Street, Matthew realized with sudden clarity, or what Oak Street has become. The community garden we started last month looks almost exactly like this. Richard studied the painting with newfound understanding. She saw it before it existed. She envisioned the home you would create together even when she knew she wouldn't be there to share it. The realization was both heartbreaking and profoundly comforting. Olivia had somehow foreseen not just the challenges they would face after her death, but the new life they would eventually build. The path that had seemed so uncertain to Matthew had been clear in Olivia's vision, a future she had helped create even as her own time grew short. As the evening drew to a close, Victoria joined them in the gallery, her typical composure softened by the emotional context of the exhibition. The foundation would like to establish a permanent scholarship in Olivia's name for young artists from disadvantaged backgrounds. We thought perhaps the Reed Foundation might consider a matching grant, our two families working together to continue Olivia's legacy in a meaningful way. The offer represented more than a philanthropic collaboration. It was an acknowledgement that Olivia's legacy belonged to both families, that her values could be honored through cooperation rather than conflict. Victoria was extending an olive branch, not surrender, not complete acceptance of Matthew's approach to raising the children, but a genuine attempt to find common ground. I think Olivia would like that very much, Matthew agreed, recognizing the significance of the moment. As they prepared to leave, Richard drew Matthew aside for a private word. I've been thinking about our earlier disagreements. Perhaps I was too quick to assume that wealth and social position were the only advantages worth securing for the children. Watching them tonight, their confidence, their thoughtfulness, their genuine interest in others, I'm beginning to understand what you and Olivia valued beyond material success. It wasn't a complete concession, but it represented significant movement from Richard's previous rigid position. The acknowledgement that character and values might be as important as financial security and social connection marked a potential turning point in their relationship. They're extraordinary children, Matthew said simply, not because of their potential inheritance or social connections, but because of who they are becoming as people. That's what Olivia cared about most, not what they would have, but who they would be. Richard nodded, a flash of regret crossing his features. I wish I had understood that better while she was with us. Perhaps there would have been fewer arguments, less estrangement, more time together. The admission of regret, so uncharacteristic of Richard's typically unapologetic demeanor, revealed the grief he usually kept carefully contained beneath his businesslike exterior. For all their differences in values and approach, Matthew and Richard shared the profound loss of the woman who had connected them. And in that shared loss, perhaps the beginning of genuine understanding could take root. 2 years after moving into Oak Street, the Reed family gathered in their backyard for a celebration. The once neglected house now stood transformed not into a showplace of wealth or status, but into a warm, welcoming home that reflected the journey its inhabitants had traveled together. The garden bloomed with vegetables and flowers, many transplanted from Olivia's original garden at the brownstone. The newly built studio at the back of the property housed Sophie's growing collection of artwork alongside preserved pieces of Olivia's that Victoria had gifted to the children. Friends and neighbors filled the yard, Eleanor directing food preparation with military precision, James engaging a group of children with historical stories, Gabriel Santos and his family setting up tables and chairs. Rebecca Rivera arrived with a group of teachers from Jefferson, where Noah and Sophie continued to thrive academically and socially. Even the Hamiltons were present, Richard somewhat stiff, but making visible efforts to engage with the other guests. Victoria more relaxed than Matthew had ever seen her, helping Sophie arrange her artwork for display. The occasion was the official launch of the Olivia Reed Community Arts Center, a joint project of the Reed Foundation and the Hamilton Foundation. Housed in a renovated building just blocks from Jefferson Middle School, the center would provide arts education, exhibition, space for emerging artists, and community gathering areas, all free of charge to neighborhood residents. It represented the vision Olivia had painted in her final triptych, a community united across differences of wealth and background, engaged in creating something meaningful together. As Matthew watched his children move confidently among the guests, Noah explaining the center's architecture to an interested neighbor, Sophie proudly showing Victoria her latest paintings, he felt Olivia's presence more strongly than he had since her death. Not as a ghost or a memory, but as a continuing influence, a set of values and visions made manifest through the lives they were building. Victoria Harris approached, a rare smile softening her typically professional demeanor. Olivia would be proud of what you've accomplished, Mr. Reed. Not just the foundation or the arts center, but the family you've nurtured through extraordinary circumstances. Matthew nodded, watching as Richard Hamilton awkwardly but sincerely complimented Eleanor on her garden design, a small but significant bridging of worlds that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. We're still figuring it out day by day. The Hamiltons and I will never agree completely on parenting philosophy or values, but we found a way to give Noah and Sophie the best of both worlds: financial security and social connection from their grandparents, grounding in community, and service from our life here. A compromise Olivia herself might have engineered, Victoria observed. She always did have a talent for seeing the bigger picture, for understanding how seemingly opposed perspectives might ultimately serve a common purpose. As the gathering continued into evening lanterns, illuminating the yard with warm golden light, Matthew found himself on the porch steps with Noah and Sophie, taking a momentary break from the celebration. In the distance, they could see the lights of downtown, the Hamilton Tower, rising above other buildings, its presence no longer threatening, but simply part of the landscape that formed their expanded world. "Do you think Mom knew we'd end up here?" Sophie asked, leaning comfortably against Matthew's side. "In this house, with these people." Matthew thought about Olivia's final painting, the vision of Oak Street she had somehow foreseen. He thought about the trust she had established, the letters she had written, the path she had helped create, even knowing she wouldn't walk it with them. "I think she hoped we would find our way to something like this. Not the exact circumstances, perhaps, but the essentials: a home built on love rather than luxury, a community based on genuine connection, a life rich in meaning and purpose." Noah, ever practical, considered this thoughtfully. "So the money was just to make sure we could choose our own path, not to make us rich, but to give us freedom." "Exactly," Matthew said, a surge of pride warming him at his son's insight. "Your mother understood something important, that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the quality of our connections, the depth of our experiences, and the impact of our choices. Money is just a tool. What matters is what you build with it." The children's relationship with their grandparents had evolved significantly over the past year. The formal visitation schedule had gradually given way to a more natural rhythm of family gatherings and shared activities. Richard had discovered Noah's interest in engineering and had begun taking him to visit historic bridges and buildings around the city, explaining the architectural principles behind their design. Victoria had become Sophie's art mentor, introducing her to museum curators and working artists who could nurture her developing talent. Matthew had worried initially that the Hamiltons' influence would undermine the values he and Olivia had tried to instill, but the opposite had occurred. Exposure to both worlds had given the children a more nuanced understanding of privilege and responsibility. They moved between their modest life on Oak Street and the luxury of the Hamilton estate with remarkable ease, neither dazzled by wealth nor embarrassed by simplicity. The turning point had come 6 months earlier, when Victoria had invited the entire Oak Street community to a garden party at the Hamilton estate. Matthew had been skeptical of her motives, but the event had proven transformative. Watching Gabriel's children splashing in the estate's pool alongside the children of Hamilton Industries executives, seeing Eleanor deep in conversation with Victoria's society friends about educational reform, Matthew had realized that the walls between these worlds were more permeable than he had believed. The Hamiltons were changing too. Richard had begun using his business connections to support small entrepreneurs in underserved neighborhoods, inspired by the resourcefulness he had witnessed in the Oak Street community. Victoria had joined the board of Jefferson Middle School, advocating for arts education in public schools with the same fervor she had once reserved for private academies. These changes hadn't come without challenges. There had been heated arguments about educational choices, about how much structure the children needed, about the appropriate balance between achievement and joy. But beneath these disagreements lay a growing mutual respect, a recognition that both Matthew and the Hamiltons wanted the children to thrive, even if they sometimes disagreed about what thriving looked like. As the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, Victoria approached Matthew with an unexpected proposal. "Richard and I have been discussing the brownstone. It's been sitting empty since you left, and we think it's time to put it to better use. We'd like to donate it to the Reed Foundation to create a residential art program for promising students who lack resources." Matthew was momentarily speechless. The brownstone represented so much of their shared history with Olivia, both the joy of their early family life and the pain of their abrupt eviction. For the Hamiltons to relinquish control of it was a profound gesture of reconciliation. That's incredibly generous, he said finally. Olivia would have loved knowing her home was nurturing young artists. Victoria nodded, her usual composure briefly softened by emotion. It should have been yours all along. This feels like a way to correct that mistake to honor what Olivia valued most. The admission was the closest Victoria would ever come to apologizing for the eviction, but Matthew understood what it cost her. Pride had always been Victoria's defining characteristic, her certainty in her own rightness, a shield against vulnerability. To acknowledge even indirectly that she had been wrong represented significant growth. The foundation would be honored to accept, he said simply. We'll make it something extraordinary. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Matthew sat on the front porch with James watching fireflies dance across the yard, their intermittent glow like distant stars brought to earth. I never expected to end up here, Matthew admitted. When we first arrived on Oak Street, I was just trying to survive, to keep the family together. I couldn't imagine building something that would extend beyond us. James nodded, his weathered face thoughtful in the porch light. That's how it often works. We start by protecting what we love and end up creating something that serves a larger purpose. Olivia understood that principle when she established the foundation. She saw further than any of us, Matthew agreed. Sometimes I wonder if she knew exactly how this would unfold, the Hamiltons, the community, all of it. I doubt she envisioned the specific details, James said. But she understood the essential truth that love persists beyond loss, that connections matter more than possessions, that meaning comes from contribution rather than accumulation. She trusted you to build on that foundation, whatever form it might take. The truth of James's words resonated deeply with Matthew. Olivia hadn't left him a blueprint, but something more valuable, a compass to navigate by, a set of principles that had guided their decisions through the darkest times. The specific path they had taken mattered less than the direction they had traveled, away from isolation and toward community, from scarcity, thinking, to abundance, from loss to renewal. The next morning, Matthew woke early to find Sophie already at her easel in the backyard, capturing the sunrise over the oak trees that gave their street its name. Her brush moved with confident strokes, her face serene with concentration. At 10, she already showed remarkable talent, but more importantly, she approached her art with joy rather than perfectionism, with curiosity instead of competition. That's beautiful, Matthew said, standing beside her. Sophie didn't look up from her work, but a small smile curved her lips. I'm trying to get the light right. Mom always said morning light was honest. It shows things as they really are, not how we wish they were. The observation was so typically Olivia that Matthew felt a momentary ache of missing her, followed by gratitude that her wisdom lived on in their daughter's mind and heart. She was right about that. What do you see in this honest light? Sophie considered the question seriously, stepping back to study her painting. I see our home, how it's changed since we came here. It looks stronger now, more settled, like it knows we belong here. Noah emerged from the house carrying a tray with orange juice and toast. Dad, there's a package on the porch, special delivery. Matthew hadn't been expecting anything, but when he saw the return address, Caldwell Bishop and Associates, he understood. Victoria Harris had mentioned that Olivia had left additional instructions to be delivered on the second anniversary of Matthew's appointment as trustee of the Reed Foundation. The package contained a single envelope sealed with wax in an old-fashioned manner that made Matthew smile. Olivia had always appreciated such traditional touches, finding beauty in small ceremonies and rituals. Inside was a letter written in Olivia's distinctive hand, the paper high quality and subtly textured, the kind she reserved for important correspondence. My dearest Matthew, it began. If you're reading this, then 2 years have passed since you learned about the foundation. 2 years of decisions made, challenges, faced a new life built from the remnants of our old one. I wish I could have witnessed this journey with you, but I take comfort in knowing that you haven't walked it alone. Our children are with you, and I hope you've found others to share the path as well. Matthew glanced up at Noah and Sophie, who were setting the breakfast table on the porch, arguing good-naturedly about who would get the last piece of Eleanor's banana bread. They had found their way through grief to a new kind of joy, different from what they had known before, but genuine nonetheless. When I established the foundation, Olivia's letter continued, I was driven by 2 impulses that might seem contradictory. I wanted to protect you and the children from my parents' financial control, but I also wanted to provide you with resources to build a meaningful life after I was gone. The 2-year delay in informing you about your full inheritance was my attempt to resolve this contradiction, to give you time to establish your independence while ensuring you wouldn't face unnecessary hardship indefinitely. Matthew remembered his anger when he first learned of Olivia's arrangement, the sense of betrayal that she had kept such an important secret. That anger had long since faded, replaced by understanding of the impossible position she had faced, trying to prepare for a future she wouldn't share, to protect her family from challenges she could foresee but not prevent. The foundation is now yours to guide, shaped by the values we shared, but responsive to the world as you find it. I've left instructions that on this anniversary, the remaining assets of the Ellington Trust should be transferred directly to you personally. This isn't meant as a test or a challenge, simply as a gift, resources to use as you see fit, whether for the children's education, for your own pursuits, or for whatever brings meaning to your lives. Matthew was startled by this revelation. The foundation's assets were substantial, but he had understood them to be restricted to charitable purposes. The idea of personal wealth of money he could use without accountability to a board or a mission statement was both liberating and unsettling. You may wonder why I didn't tell you about any of this while I was alive, Olivia wrote as if anticipating his thoughts. The truth is one simple and complicated. I wanted our daily life to be guided by choice, rather than obligation, by love, rather than luxury. I wanted our children to know the value of enough before they encountered the temptations of excess. But I also feared my parents' interference, their attempt to use financial leverage to reshape our family according to their values. Noah appeared at Matthew's side, peering curiously at the letter. Is that from Mom? Yes, Matthew said, drawing his son close with one arm. She left it for us to read today. Noah nodded solemnly. She was really smart, wasn't she? She figured out how to make sure we'd be okay even when she couldn't be here. She was brilliant, Matthew agreed, and she loved you both more than anything in the world. Sophie joined them, leaning against Matthew's other side. What does the rest of the letter say? Matthew continued reading aloud, sharing Olivia's words with the children that she had loved so fiercely. My hope for you all is simple, that you use these resources not just to ease your path, but to make it meaningful. That you remember wealth is valuable only in what it allows you to build, to protect, to nurture. That you teach our children through your example that character isn't determined by comfort, that worth isn't measured by wealth, that family is defined by love rather than lineage. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. We remember Mom. Dad makes sure we remember every day. Matthew felt his own eyes growing damp as he read the final paragraph. I have absolute faith in the family you'll create from the foundation we built together. It may not look exactly as we imagined, but I know it will be grounded in the values we shared: honesty, compassion, the courage to stand firm when others would compromise for convenience. These are the qualities I fell in love with, Matthew, the legacy I want our children to inherit. Trust yourself to guide them forward. You have always been enough just as you are. All my love, always, Olivia. For a long moment, the three of them sat in silence, the letter, a tangible connection to the woman who had shaped their lives in ways both seen and unseen. Then Noah, practical as always, asked the question that would have made Olivia smile with its directness. So what happens now? Dad, are we rich? Matthew considered how to answer. The concept of wealth had become more nuanced for him over the past 2 years, its meaning transformed by experience. We have resources, he said carefully, more than we need for ourselves. That means we have choices about how to use what we have to make our own lives comfortable, yes, but also to create opportunities for others. Like Mom did with the foundation, Sophie observed. Exactly. Your mother understood that money is powerful, but it's also neutral. It becomes good or bad depending on how it's used, what it's used for. She trusted us to use it wisely to build something meaningful with it. Noah's brow furrowed in concentration. So we should keep living like we do now, not like Grandma and Grandpa Hamilton. Matthew smiled at his son's perceptiveness. I think we can find a middle path. We don't need a mansion or luxury cars, but we also don't need to work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. We can make choices based on what matters to us, not what we can or can't afford. I like our house, Sophie declared firmly, but maybe we could make the studio bigger and fix Mrs. Murphy's roof. She said it leaks when it rains hard. And maybe we could help Mr. Santos get a new truck for his construction business, Noah added. He said his old one keeps breaking down and it costs him jobs. Matthew felt a swell of pride in his children's instinctive generosity, their understanding that resources brought responsibility as well as opportunity. Those sound like excellent ideas. We can start making a list of ways to use our resources that align with what matters most to us. As they finished breakfast and began clearing the dishes, Matthew felt a sense of clarity that had been elusive in the months following Olivia's death. The path forward wasn't about choosing between the values of Oak Street and the advantages of the Hamilton world. It was about integrating the best of both the community connection and mutual support of their neighborhood with the educational opportunities and cultural experiences the Hamiltons valued. The Reed Foundation would continue its work supporting arts education and community development. The collaboration with the Hamilton Foundation would bridge worlds that had once seemed incompatible, and their personal resources would allow them to live comfortably while remaining rooted in the community that had embraced them at their lowest point. Later that day, Matthew called Victoria Harris to discuss the transfer of the Ellington Trust assets and the legal implications of Olivia's instructions. The lawyer was unsurprised by the development. Olivia was very clear about her wishes, Victoria explained. She wanted you to have a period of structured responsibility through the foundation before gaining full discretion over the remaining assets. From what I've observed over the past 2 years, her confidence in your judgment was well placed. It's still overwhelming, Matthew admitted. The responsibility of it, the potential for misuse. That concern is precisely why she trusted you, Victoria said simply. Those who worry about misusing power are generally the least likely to do so. After ending the call, Matthew sat on the front porch watching Noah and Sophie playing with the neighborhood children in the street. Their game had complex rules that seemed to evolve by the minute, with much negotiation and occasional good-natured disputes. They were learning the art of compromise, of community, of shared purpose lessons no private academy could teach so effectively. Victoria and Richard Hamilton arrived for their weekly dinner, Richard carrying a portfolio of architectural plans, Victoria with a carefully wrapped painting. They had relaxed into their grandparental roles, finding ways to share their knowledge and connections without attempting to control the children's development. The revelation of the Reed Foundation had humbled them initially, forcing them to reconsider their assumptions about Matthew's capabilities and Olivia's choices. But over time, humility had given way to genuine respect and even to friendship. "We've been discussing the brownstone conversion," Richard announced as they settled in the living room. "I've had some preliminary plans drawn up for the residential studios. I thought Noah might be interested in the engineering challenges involved." Noah's face lit up with enthusiasm. Though only 12, he showed a precocious understanding of structural principles and spatial relationships. Richard had recognized this talent and had begun nurturing it with the same dedication he had once reserved for corporate protégés. "And I've brought something for Sophie," Victoria said carefully, unwrapping the painting she had carried. "It's one of Olivia's early works, a self-portrait she painted at about your age. I thought it might inspire your own explorations in the genre." Sophie received the painting with reverent hands, studying her mother's youthful face with intense concentration. "She looks happy," she observed, "and determined, like she knew exactly what she wanted to paint." "She always did," Victoria agreed, a wistful smile softening her elegant features. "Even as a child, she had a clarity of vision that was remarkable. I see that same quality in you." The simple acknowledgement of continuity between generations of shared traits that transcended loss created a moment of connection more powerful than any formal reconciliation could have achieved. In recognizing Sophie as her own person, while honoring her connection to Olivia, Victoria had found the balance that had eluded her in the difficult months after her daughter's death. The evening unfolded with comfortable familiarity. Dinner on the porch, conversation that ranged from the children's school projects to community developments to plans for the Arts Center's first exhibition. The Hamiltons no longer seemed out of place in the modest setting, and Matthew no longer felt defensive about the contrast between their lifestyle and his own. Each family had found value in the other's perspective, enriching their shared commitment to Noah and Sophie's well-being. As summer approached, Matthew began considering the Hamiltons' invitation for the children to spend a week at the estate. It would be their first extended stay without him, a test of the trust that had gradually developed between the families. Noah was eager for the experience, particularly after Richard mentioned the architectural tour he had planned. Sophie was more hesitant, worried about leaving her art projects and neighborhood friends. "You don't have to go if you're not ready," Matthew assured her. "This isn't an obligation, just an opportunity." Sophie considered this carefully, her expression thoughtful beyond her years. "I think I want to try," she said finally. "Mom would want me to know both sides of my family, wouldn't she? To understand where I come from." "She would," Matthew agreed, touched by his daughter's insight. and she'd be proud of your courage in trying something that makes you a little nervous. The day the children left for the Hamilton estate, Matthew felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in their growing independence, concern about their well-being and away from him, and a quiet gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment of tentative trust. Victoria promised daily updates and assured him he could visit whenever he wished. Richard had planned activities that balanced educational experiences with simple fun, a consideration that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The house felt strangely quiet without the children's presence, giving Matthew time to reflect on the path they had traveled since Olivia's death. The grief remained a shadow that would never entirely disappear, but it had been joined by new experiences: joy in the children's growth, satisfaction in work that mattered, connection to a community that had become family in all the ways that counted. One evening during this children's absence, Eleanor Murphy stopped by with a basket of tomatoes from her garden and found Matthew sorting through old photographs on the living room floor. "Creating a memory book?" she asked, settling into her usual chair. "Something like that," Matthew replied. "I realize the children have fewer pictures of their early years than I'd like. Most of our photos were digital, stored on accounts I no longer have access to. These are the physical ones we managed to take with us when we left the brownstone." Eleanor studied a photograph of Olivia holding infant twins, her face radiant with exhausted joy. "She was extraordinary, wasn't she? The kind of person who changed everyone she touched." "She was," Matthew agreed. "Sometimes I worry the children will forget her, that their memories will fade as they grow." "They won't forget," Eleanor said with quiet certainty. "Not with you to remind them, not with her values evident in how you live each day. Besides, children remember more than we give them credit for, not just events, but feelings, impressions, the essence of what mattered." Matthew nodded, gathering the photographs into a semblance of order. "I've been thinking about what to do with the personal inheritance, the assets Olivia left directly to me rather than to the foundation. I want to use it in a way that honors her, that extends her influence beyond our family." "What are you considering?" Eleanor asked. "A scholarship program, perhaps, for students interested in combining art with community service, or an endowment for the Arts Center to ensure it remains accessible to everyone. Something that reflects Olivia's belief that creativity and compassion should be nurtured wherever they're found, regardless of financial circumstances." Eleanor smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I think she would approve of either option, or both. The wonderful thing about resources is that they allow you to say yes more often than no." The week passed quickly, filled with foundation work, planning for the Arts Center's opening, and quiet evenings spent reading books he had set aside during the busier seasons of rebuilding their lives. When the day came to pick up the children, Matthew drove to the Hamilton estate with a sense of anticipation rather than apprehension. The grand gates that had once seemed forbidding now simply marked a transition between different aspects of their expanded world. Noah and Sophie burst from the house as soon as his car pulled into the circular drive, racing toward him, with stories tumbling over each other: the sailboat trip on the lake, the visit to the Science Museum, the afternoon spent in Victoria's art collection vault, examining works by masters Sophie had previously seen only in books. "And Grandpa showed me the original blueprints for the tower," Noah exclaimed, his eyes bright with excitement. "They're over 100 years old, but you can still see all the details. He says maybe I could be an architect someday if I want. And Grandma introduced me to Miss Chen, who's a real artist with paintings in museums," Sophie added. "She said I could visit her studio sometime to see how professional artists work." Their enthusiasm was genuine, their experiences clearly positive, but Matthew noticed something equally important: they were happy to be going home. They asked about the neighbors, wondered if Mrs. Kim's cat had had her kittens, yet wanted to know if the community garden vegetables had grown while they were away. The Hamilton world had expanded their horizons without replacing their connection to Oak Street. Victoria appeared on the porch, elegant as always, but more relaxed than in their earlier encounters. "They've been wonderful guests," she said, embracing each child with genuine affection. "We've all learned a great deal from each other." Richard joined them, carrying Sophie's sketchbook and Noah's notebook, filled with architectural observations. "Next time, perhaps we could arrange a longer visit," he suggested tentatively. "There's an architectural tour in Chicago I think Noah would enjoy, and the Art Institute has a youth program Sophie might find valuable." The request was offered as a suggestion rather than a demand, respectful of Matthew's authority, while expressing a genuine desire for more time with their grandchildren. 2 years ago, such a balanced approach would have seemed impossible for the controlling patriarch who had orchestrated their eviction. "We'll discuss it," Matthew promised. I appreciate how thoughtful you have been about their interests. As they prepared to leave, Victoria drew Matthew aside for a private word. I want you to know that Richard and I have been reconsidering our estate plans. We'd like to establish a trust for Noah and Sophie that would complement the Reed Foundation's work focused on architectural preservation and arts education areas where each child has shown particular interest. The offer represented more than financial provision for the children's future. It acknowledged their individual talents and passions, respecting them as unique people rather than extensions of the Hamilton legacy. That's very generous, Matthew said. I'm sure they would be honored to continue your work in those areas. It's not about obligation, Victoria clarified, echoing Matthew's earlier words to Sophie. It's about opportunity, the chance to build on foundations laid by those who came before while determining their own path forward. The parallels to Olivia's philosophy were unmistakable, suggesting that Victoria had absorbed more from her daughter's choices than Matthew had realized. Perhaps this was Olivia's most enduring legacy, not the financial resources she had protected for her family, but the values she had lived so consistently that even those who initially rejected them had gradually come to understand their worth. The drive home was filled with more stories from the children's week away, but as they approached Oak Street, their conversation shifted to the neighborhood plans for the community garden ideas for the Arts Center, friends they were eager to see again. Their ability to appreciate both worlds without being defined by either reflected a maturity beyond their years, a capacity for nuance that would serve them well as they navigated an increasingly complex world. As they turned onto their street, Matthew was surprised to see a crowd gathered in front of their house. Neighbors, friends, teachers from Jefferson, even some of the foundation staff. A banner stretched across the front porch read, "Welcome Home Reeds," and tables laden with potluck dishes filled the yard. "What's all this?" Noah asked, his eyes wide with surprise. "It looks like the neighborhood missed you," Matthew said, touched by the spontaneous welcome. Eleanor approached as they parked, her smile warm with affection. "We thought you might need a proper homecoming. The children have been the talk of the neighborhood all week. Everyone's been wondering how they were faring in the land of luxury." Sophie laughed, already scanning the crowd for her friends. "It was fun, but I'm glad to be home. They don't even play kickball there." The celebration lasted well into the evening. Neighbors bringing food and stories. Children playing games in the street, adults discussing community projects and sharing news of the week. The Hamiltons would have found it chaotic and unstructured, but to Matthew it represented everything they had built since arriving on Oak Street: connections based on genuine care rather than obligation, joy found in simple pleasures rather than expensive entertainments, a sense of belonging that no amount of money could purchase. As twilight settled over the neighborhood, Matthew found himself on the porch steps watching the scene with a sense of profound gratitude. James Chen joined him, offering a glass of lemonade and his customary quiet wisdom. "You've created something remarkable here," the older man observed. "Not just a home for your family, but a bridge between worlds that seemed incompatible." Matthew shook his head. "I didn't create it alone. Olivia laid the foundation, the children built on it with their resilience and openness, and everyone here, you, Eleanor, the neighbors, even the Hamiltons, eventually contributed to what it's become." "That's precisely what makes it remarkable," James replied. "Individual achievement is common enough. True community, genuine connection across differences of experience and perspective, that's a rare accomplishment." In the yard, Sophie was teaching younger children how to mix colors for the mural they were painting on an old sheet strung between trees. Noah was deep in conversation with a Gabriel Santos about structural improvements for the Arts Center, his notebook open to sketches that showed surprising sophistication for a 12-year-old. They were finding their paths, developing their gifts, becoming the people Olivia had hoped they would be. The Olivia Reed Community Arts Center would open the following month, bringing arts education to children who might otherwise never have access to it. The Reed Foundation would continue supporting initiatives that aligned with their values, creating opportunities for others to discover their worth beyond material measures. The Hamilton Connection would provide access to resources and experiences that enrich the children's understanding of the world, while their Oak Street roots kept them grounded in what mattered most. And at the center of it all was the family they had built together, not the one Matthew and Olivia had originally envisioned, but one that honored her memory through its commitment to the values they had shared. It wasn't perfect, and it would continue to evolve as the children grew and circumstances changed. But it was genuine, resilient, and rich in the ways that truly mattered. As darkness fell and neighbors began to depart, Matthew helped Sophie and Noah gather their belongings and head inside. The house welcomed them with familiar comfort, not the elegant luxury of the Hamilton estate, but a warmth that came from the life they had built within its walls. Later, after the children were asleep, Matthew sat on the front porch with Olivia's final letter and her wedding ring, tangible connections to the woman who had shaped their lives in ways both seen and unseen. The neighborhood was quiet, now houses dark, except for occasional porch lights illuminating the way home for late returners. In the distance, the Hamilton Tower stood outlines against the night sky, its presence no longer threatening, but simply part of the landscape that formed their expanded world. Closer, the oak trees that gave their street its name rustled in the gentle breeze, their branches creating intricate patterns against the star-filled sky. Matthew turned Olivia's ring in his palm, feeling its smooth contours, remembering the day he had placed it on her finger and the promise they had made to build a life together. That promise hadn't ended with her death. It had simply changed form, becoming a commitment to continue what they had begun to raise their children according to the values they had shared to create meaning from loss. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of despair when the challenges seemed insurmountable, times of anger when the injustice of their situation overwhelmed him, periods of uncertainty when the path forward was obscured by grief and fear. But there had also been unexpected joys. Sophie's artistic development, Noah's growing confidence, the community that had embraced them at their lowest point, even the gradual reconciliation with the Hamiltons that had given the children a fuller sense of their heritage. Olivia had seen further than any of them, understanding that true wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts or social status. It lay in connections that sustained you through hardship and work, that gave your days purpose in love that transcended loss. She had provided financial resources not as an end in themselves, but as tools to build the life she hoped her family would find after she was gone. And they had found it not exactly as she might have envisioned, but aligned with the values she had lived by. They had created a home defined by love rather than luxury, formed a community based on mutual support rather than social position, built a legacy focused on contribution rather than accumulation. The money hadn't made these things possible, but it had removed obstacles that might have made the journey more difficult. As Matthew finally rose to go inside, he took one last look at the quiet street, the humble houses with their porch lights glowing like earthbound stars. This wasn't the life he had expected when he married Olivia Hamilton, the talented artist from one of the city's wealthiest families. It was both simpler and more complex, more challenging and more rewarding than anything he could have imagined. But it was theirs, built through choices made, challenges faced, a new life created from the remnants of the old one. And in that creation lay Olivia's true legacy, not the financial resources she had protected, but the values she had lived so fully that they continued to guide her family long after she was gone. Matthew slipped the ring back into his pocket and went inside, closing the door on the quiet street. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new choices to make. But the foundation was solid, built not on shifting sand of circumstance, but on the bedrock of values that endured. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, guided by the principles Olivia had taught them, that true wealth lay in connection rather than possession, that meaning came from contribution rather than accumulation, that family was defined by love rather than lineage. And in that understanding, they had found the most priceless legacy of all.